Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The highway stretched before me like a black tongue licking at the star-drunk sky, its yellow center line hypnotic in the sweep of my headlights. Route 49 had always been a lonely stretch of asphalt, especially at this ungodly hour, but tonight it felt different, heavier somehow, as if the darkness pressed against my windshield with deliberate intent. I'd been driving for 3 hours straight, fleeing the suffocating walls of my apartment after another sleepless night. The city had become a cage of fluorescent lights and constant noise, and my doctor's latest prescription sat untouched in my medicine cabinet. Just drive, I'd told myself. Clear your head. The radio had given up its signal an hour ago, leaving me with nothing but the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional ping of insects against glass. My fuel gauge hovered just above a quarter tank, enough to reach the next town, assuming I could find one in this godforsaken stretch of nowhere. That's when I noticed the lane. It appeared in my peripheral vision first, a ghost of pavement that seemed to materialize from the shoulder. Not an on-ramp or merge lane, something else entirely. A perfect strip of asphalt running parallel to the main highway, separated by perhaps 50 feet of scrub grass and weeds. No signs, no markings, no explanation for its existence. I slowed, squinting through the passenger window. The lane was empty, naturally. What traffic would use an unmarked road to nowhere? But something about its pristine condition bothered me. While the main highway showed decades of wear, cracked shoulders, faded paint, potholes patched with tar, this phantom lane looked freshly poured, its surface gleaming like wet obsidian under my high beams. Focus on the road, I commanded myself, but my eyes kept drifting toward that impossible strip of pavement. It ran perfectly straight, never wavering, never ending, like a ruler drawn across the landscape by some cosmic hand. The first time I checked my rearview mirror, I saw only darkness. The second time, 30 seconds later, there was a man sitting in my back seat. My heart hammered against my ribs as I yanked the wheel hard right, gravel spraying from beneath my tires as I skidded onto the shoulder. The car lurched to a stop, engine idling roughly, my breath fogging the windshield in rapid puffs. I spun around, expecting to confront an intruder, a hitchhiker, a hallucination, anything that would explain what I'd seen reflected in that small rectangle of glass. But the back seat was empty. Dry upholstery, no depression in the cushions, no lingering warmth or scent of another human being. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the interior light switch. The dome bulb cast everything in sickly yellow, transforming the familiar interior of my Honda into something alien and hostile. I checked the floor, the corners, even popped the trunk release and walked around to peer inside. Nothing. You're losing it, I thought. But the conviction felt hollow. I'd seen him clearly, not a trick of shadows or the play of oncoming headlights, but a distinct human figure, middle-aged, wearing what looked like a dark suit. His face had been turned toward the window, as if he were gazing out at something in the distance, completely oblivious to my presence. I slammed the trunk and returned to the driver's seat, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. The empty lane still ran alongside the highway, its surface now seeming to pulse with an inner light that had nothing to do with my headlights. Get back on the road, I told myself. Find the next town, find a motel, sleep this off. But as I reached for the gear shift, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. The rear passenger window was fogged with what looked like breath marks, and in that condensation, 5 perfect fingerprints were slowly fading like mist. I don't remember pulling back onto the highway or accelerating to 70 miles per hour. I only remember the desperate need to put distance between myself and that spot, as if geography could somehow erase what I'd witnessed. The speedometer needle climbed to 80, then 85, the engine straining against the darkness. But the empty lane kept pace with me, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. And every few minutes, I found myself checking the rearview mirror with a mixture of dread and compulsion, like probing a sore tooth with your tongue. The third time I looked, he was there again. This time I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My foot remained pressed to the accelerator even as my rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that the laws of physics and common sense were being violated in the confines of my own vehicle. The figure sat in the exact same position, hands folded in his lap, face turned toward the window. He wore a charcoal gray suit with thin lapels, the kind you might see in old photographs from the 50s or 60s. I tried speaking to him, my voice cracking with strain. "Who are you? What do you want?" But if he heard me, he gave no indication. He simply sat there, patient as stone, while the empty lane rushed past outside his window. When I checked the mirror again 30 seconds later, he was gone. But this time I could smell him. It was the scent of old wool and mothballs, aftershave that had been discontinued decades ago, and underneath it all, something else. Something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of basement corners and forgotten storage rooms. The smell lingered for minutes, growing stronger rather than weaker, until I had to crack the windows despite the cold night air. It didn't help. If anything, the frigid wind seemed to carry the odor deeper into the car's interior, as if it were seeping from the upholstery itself. I tried the radio again, desperate for human voices, for proof that the world still contained other people living normal lives. Static hissed from the speakers, occasionally resolving into fragments of late-night talk shows or country music stations. But the signals never held for more than a few seconds before dissolving back into white noise. Mile after mile, the empty lane maintained its impossible parallel course. I began to notice details that shouldn't have been visible in the darkness. The perfect smoothness of its surface, unmarked by tire tracks or road debris. The way it seemed to generate its own faint luminescence. The complete absence of roadside features. No guardrails, no drainage ditches, no utility poles. It's not real, I told myself, but the words felt like lies even as I thought them. The lane was there, solid and undeniable, mocking my attempts at rational explanation. The fourth appearance was different. This time, when I checked the mirror, the man was looking directly at me. His eyes were dark holes in a face the color of old parchment, and his mouth was moving as if he were speaking, though I heard nothing over the rush of wind and engine noise. His lips formed shapes that might have been words, urgent and repetitive, like someone trying to communicate across a vast distance. I found myself leaning forward, straining to read his lips in the small rectangle of reflected glass. The words seemed familiar, as if I'd heard them before in dreams or half-remembered conversations, but I couldn't quite grasp their meaning. Then he raised one pale hand and pointed, not at me, but past me, toward the empty lane running alongside the highway. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I turned to look directly at that impossible strip of asphalt. There were other cars on it. They moved in perfect formation, spaced exactly 30 feet apart, their headlights cutting through the darkness in synchronized sweeps. Classic automobiles from decades past. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, a 1963 Ford Thunderbird, a 1969 Dodge Charger, all pristine, all gleaming under some invisible light source. And in each car, barely visible through tinted windows, sat solitary figures in dark suits. They drove with mechanical precision, never changing speed, never varying their spacing, never acknowledging the world beyond their phantom highway. As I watched, transfixed with horror, one of the drivers turned to look at me. The same face I'd been seeing in my rearview mirror, multiplied across an endless convoy of the damned. This isn't happening, I thought desperately. You're having a breakdown. Pull over, call someone, get help. But even as these rational thoughts formed, I knew I couldn't stop. Some instinct deeper than logic warned me that to leave the highway now, to break the tenuous connection between my world and theirs, would be to invite something far worse than mere observation. The procession of vintage cars continued past, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one identical in its purposeful movement, each driver wearing the same expression of patient expectation. They were waiting for something, I realized. Or someone. When I finally tore my eyes away from the spectacle and looked back at the rearview mirror, the man in my back seat was smiling. It wasn't a pleasant expression. His lips stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed wrong somehow. Too many, or too sharp, or arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate. And his eyes, those dark pits that had been gazing at me with such intensity, now held something that might have been anticipation. He pointed again, more insistently this time, and I understood with dawning horror what he wanted me to see. Ahead of us, perhaps a quarter mile down the highway, the road forked. The main route curved left, disappearing into rolling hills studded with the lights of some distant town. But the right fork led directly onto the empty lane, merging seamlessly with that phantom highway where the convoy of vintage cars continued their eternal journey. "No," I whispered, but my hands seemed to move independently of my will, already beginning to ease the steering wheel to the right. "No, I won't." The man in the back seat leaned forward, and for the first time, I heard his voice, not through my ears, but directly inside my skull, like thoughts that weren't my own. "You've been driving this road for 47 years, Thomas. Isn't it time to come home?" The fork rushed toward me, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I had a choice to make. I could fight whatever force was drawing me toward that impossible lane, could wrench the wheel left and flee toward the safety of town and normal people and electric lights. Or I could accept what the smiling figure in my mirror seemed to know already, that I belonged with those other solitary drivers, that I'd been avoiding this moment for longer than I cared to remember. My foot hovered over the brake pedal, but I couldn't seem to press it down. The speedometer needle held steady at 70 miles per hour, carrying me inexorably toward the decision point where two realities intersected. In the mirror, the man's smile widened further, and I caught a glimpse of something behind his two bright teeth. Not darkness, but a depth that seemed to extend far beyond the confines of my small car, as if his mouth were a doorway to somewhere else entirely. "Time to choose," his voice whispered in my mind. "Time to remember." The fork was 50 yards away now, then 20, then 10. I could see the smooth surface of the empty lane waiting to receive me, could see the convoy of vintage cars maintaining their perfect formation as they welcomed another lost soul into their ranks. At the last possible moment, my hands jerked the wheel hard left. The Honda skidded onto the main highway, tires screaming against asphalt as I fought to maintain control. In the rearview mirror, I watched the empty lane and its parade of ghostly vehicles recede into the distance, becoming just another impossible memory in a night full of them. But the man in the back seat remained. He was no longer smiling. In fact, his expression had shifted to something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps pity. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of infinite patience. "Tomorrow night, then, or the next. We'll be waiting, Thomas. We'll always be waiting." I drove straight through to the next town without stopping, my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, refusing to look in any mirrors or check any reflections. I found an all-night diner and sat in a booth by the window until sunrise, drinking coffee that tasted like ashes and watching normal people live their normal lives. When I finally returned to my car, the back seat was empty and dry, showing no signs of recent occupation. The faint smell of old wool and mothballs had faded, leaving only the familiar scents of vinyl and air freshener. But on the rear passenger window, barely visible unless you knew where to look, 5 finger-shaped impressions remained pressed into the glass. Not fingerprints exactly, but something deeper, as if the window itself remembered the touch of an impossible hand. I drive a different route to work now, taking surface streets and avoiding highways whenever possible. But sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself thinking about that empty lane and the patient convoy of vintage cars. I wonder if they're still out there, maintaining their perfect formation, waiting for drivers who stayed too long on roads that shouldn't exist. And sometimes when I'm not careful about which mirrors I look into, I catch glimpses of charcoal gray fabric in my peripheral vision, just enough to remind me that some invitations, once extended, never quite expire. The choice, it seems, remains mine to make. For now. Story 2. The bedside clock glowed 3:07 a.m. when I jolted awake, my chest tight with the suffocating certainty that someone else was breathing in my room. The darkness pressed against my eyes like velvet, thick and absolute, but I could feel it, a presence hovering just beyond the foot of my bed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear anything beyond the whisper-quiet hum of the air conditioning. Nothing. Just my own ragged breathing and the distant rumble of late-night traffic bleeding through the walls of my apartment. I sat up slowly, the mattress springs creaking in protest. The sensation lingered, clinging to my skin like humidity. That unmistakable feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. My apartment had never felt this way before. I'd lived here for 3 years, knew every shadow, every sound the building made as it settled into the night. This was different. This was wrong. The hallway light sensor flickered on as I stepped out of my bedroom, casting everything in harsh fluorescent white. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my pupils contracting painfully. That's when I saw it. My own silhouette was moving across the wall at the far end of the hallway. Not a shadow. My actual silhouette, complete in every detail, walking with my exact gait and posture. It wore the navy blue sweater and dark jeans I'd thrown on Tuesday night when I'd run down to the corner store for milk. The same clothes that were now crumpled in my laundry basket, still carrying the faint smell of rain from that evening. The figure moved with deliberate purpose, each step precise and measured. It reached the wall where my bathroom door should be, and simply kept walking, passing through the drywall like it was made of mist. The silhouette didn't pause or acknowledge my presence. It just walked through solid matter and disappeared. I stood frozen in the hallway for what felt like hours, staring at the empty wall. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. A reflection from the street, a trick of the light, maybe the stress from work finally catching up with me. But the fluorescent bulb overhead cast sharp, unforgiving shadows that eliminated any possibility of optical illusions. I pressed my palm against the wall where the figure had vanished. Solid, cold, real. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, checking locks, peering through blinds at the empty street below. Every creak of the building made my spine straighten. Every distant siren made me hold my breath. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. Work provided temporary refuge. The familiar chaos of the office, the constant buzz of conversations and ringing phones, the mundane irritation of emails and deadlines, all of it felt reassuringly normal. But as evening approached, a cold knot of dread began forming in my stomach. The thought of returning to my apartment made my hands shake. I stayed late, finding excuses to linger at my desk until the cleaning crew arrived. When I finally drove home, every streetlight seemed too bright, every shadow too dark. The building's hallway smelled wrong somehow, like ozone before a thunderstorm. Inside my apartment, I methodically checked every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person. Nothing, but the air felt different, charged with the same electric tension I'd felt the night before. I made dinner with trembling hands, dropping utensils twice before giving up and ordering takeout instead. The delivery driver was a kid, maybe 19, with nervous eyes and a patchy beard. When I opened the door, he stepped back instinctively. "You okay, man? You look..." He trailed off, studying my face with obvious concern. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror after he left. Pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, hair disheveled despite my attempts to comb it. I looked exactly like someone losing their grip on reality. That night, I left every light on. I positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of the hallway and forced myself to stay awake. The apartment felt like a museum after hours, too quiet, too still, filled with the oppressive weight of waiting. At 3:17 a.m., the temperature dropped. I watched my breath mist in the suddenly frigid air as frost began forming on the windows. The central heating was running, I could hear it cycling, but the cold seeped through everything like water through fabric. My teeth chattered as I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and kept my eyes fixed on the hallway. The silhouette appeared again, this time wearing the gray hoodie and black pants I'd had on Monday when I'd worked from home. It moved with the same unhurried confidence, walking along the wall like gravity meant nothing to it. As it passed under the light fixture, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The silhouette cast its own shadow. I watched, paralyzed, as my doppelganger and its impossible shadow moved through my apartment like they owned it. The figure paused at the kitchen entrance and turned, not toward me, but toward something I couldn't see. It raised one arm in what looked like a greeting, then continued its journey through the wall and out of sight. This time I followed. I pressed my ear against the wall, listening for any sound from the apartment next door. Mrs. Chen lived there, a quiet woman in her 70s who worked nights at the hospital. Her apartment should be empty. But I could hear movement, soft footsteps, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the barely audible creak of floorboards. The sounds moved in a pattern that mirrored the layout of my own apartment. From what I could tell, someone was walking through Mrs. Chen's place, in the exact same path the silhouette had taken through mine. I spent the next hour crouched against the wall, tracking the sounds as they moved from room to room. Kitchen to living room to bedroom and back again, over and over in a relentless loop. Whoever was next door never stopped, never paused, never broke the rhythm of their endless patrol. When morning came, I knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. She answered in her hospital scrubs, looking tired but alert. "Did you hear anything unusual last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She frowned, studying my face. "You don't look well. Are you sleeping?" "Please, just tell me if you heard anything." "Nothing," she said slowly. "I worked a double shift, just got home an hour ago. Apartment was exactly how I left it." She paused, her expression softening. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" I mumbled an apology and retreated to my apartment, her concerned gaze following me down the hallway. If she'd been gone all night, who had been walking through her apartment? What had my silhouette been greeting? The third night, I tried sleeping pills, 2 of them, enough to knock out a horse. I woke up anyway at 3:23 a.m., groggy but completely alert, like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. The room felt different, smaller somehow, as if the walls had crept inward while I slept. I stumbled to the hallway and saw not one silhouette, but 3. They moved in single file along the wall, each wearing different clothes from my recent past. The first wore my work outfit from last Friday, the second had on the running gear I'd used Saturday morning, and the third was dressed in the casual shirt and khakis I'd worn to lunch with my sister on Sunday. They walked with identical gaits, their movements perfectly synchronized like frames of animation. As I watched, transfixed with horror, more silhouettes began appearing behind them. A week's worth of clothes, a month's worth of memories, all of them walking the same endless path through my wall. They moved like a parade of my own history, each figure representing a different version of myself from days past. The procession continued for nearly an hour, dozens of silhouettes filing past in chronological order. Some wore clothes I'd forgotten I owned. Others displayed outfits that triggered specific memories. The shirt I'd worn to my job interview, the jacket from my first date with Sarah, the sweatshirt I'd had on the day my father died. They all walked through the wall and disappeared, one by one, until only empty hallway remained. I called in sick the next day, and the next. I stopped eating regular meals, surviving on whatever I could find in my pantry without leaving the apartment. The thought of going outside, of adding new clothes and new experiences to whatever collection was building in my walls, filled me with paralyzing dread. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt them moving through the walls around me, not just in Mrs. Chen's apartment, but in all the units surrounding mine. Above me, below me, on every side, an army of my former selves walking their eternal routes through spaces that existed in some twisted parallel to my own. I started finding things in my apartment that I didn't remember placing there. A coffee mug in the bathroom sink. A book open to a page I'd never read. My keys hanging on a hook I'd never used. Small changes, subtle displacements that could easily be explained by my deteriorating mental state. But they felt deliberate, purposeful. The silhouettes were learning. On the seventh night, I positioned myself in the hallway with my back against the wall, determined to block their path. If they were some manifestation of my psyche, some symptom of a breakdown, then confronting them directly might break whatever hold they had on me. At 3:31 a.m., I felt the familiar temperature drop. The first silhouette appeared, wearing the clothes I'd had on that very morning, a white t-shirt and blue jeans that were currently in my hamper. It approached my position without hesitation, its movements calm and confident. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The silhouette reached the spot where I sat and simply walked through me. The sensation was indescribable, like being filled with ice water and electricity simultaneously. For a brief moment, I felt everything the figure felt: the soft cotton of the shirt against skin, the weight of keys in a pocket, the lingering taste of coffee from hours before. I experienced my own memories from an outside perspective, watching myself brush my teeth that morning, seeing my face in the bathroom mirror with eyes that weren't quite my own. When the sensation passed, I was alone in the hallway, shaking uncontrollably. But I understood now. The silhouettes weren't just manifestations of my past. They were collecting it, cataloging every moment, every experience, every version of myself that had ever existed. I don't know how much time has passed since then. Days blur together in my apartment, marked only by the nightly processions that grow longer each time. The silhouettes have begun wearing clothes from futures I haven't lived yet. Outfits I don't recognize, styles I've never chosen. They walk with increasing confidence through my walls, and I've started to notice that the furniture in my apartment sometimes isn't quite where I left it. Sometimes I catch myself walking the same path they take, moving through my apartment with the same measured gait, the same purposeful stride. When I realize what I'm doing, I force myself to stop, but the compulsion grows stronger each day. I've stopped looking in mirrors. The last time I tried, I wasn't entirely sure if the face looking back was the one I'd worn that morning, or one I was scheduled to wear tomorrow. The building is quieter now. I haven't seen Mrs. Chen in weeks, and the sounds from neighboring apartments have faded to nothing. But the walls are full of movement, full of shadows and silhouettes walking their endless routes through spaces that exist between what is and what might be. Tonight, as I write this, I can feel them gathering in larger numbers than ever before. The temperature has dropped so low that ice crystals are forming on my windows, and the air tastes like copper and ozone. I know that when 3 a.m. comes, I'll see myself walking through that wall again, wearing clothes I've never owned, living moments I've never experienced. The question that haunts me isn't whether any of this is real. The question is which version of myself is asking it. I can hear footsteps in the walls now, getting closer. They sound exactly like mine. Story 3. The crash came at 3:17 a.m., sharp and deliberate as a gunshot in the suffocating silence of my apartment. I jerked awake, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. The darkness around me felt thick, almost solid, pressing against my skin with a weight that made breathing difficult. I lay motionless for several minutes, every muscle tensed, listening to the oppressive quiet that had swallowed the sound whole. The digital clock's green glow seemed accusatory in the blackness, its numbers burning themselves into my retinas. 3:18 now. 3:19. Time crawling forward with malicious intent. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor with a whisper that seemed to echo endlessly through the shadows. The hallway stretched before me like a throat, walls closing in with each hesitant step. The built-in wardrobe stood at the far end, its doors slightly ajar. though I distinctly remembered closing them before bed. I always closed them. The habit had become compulsive since moving into this place 6 months ago, though I couldn't explain why. The picture frame lay face down on the floor, its glass spider-webbed with cracks that caught what little light filtered through the blinds. Silver fragments sparkled like malevolent stars scattered across the dark wood. I knelt carefully, avoiding the shards, and lifted the frame with trembling fingers. It was the photograph of my parents from their anniversary dinner, the one that had been sitting safely on the wardrobe's top shelf for months. But now the glass was shattered, and something about the image itself seemed wrong. The colors looked faded, as if the photograph had aged decades in a single night. My father's smile appeared strained, forced. My mother's eyes seemed to be looking directly at me with an expression I'd never noticed before, a mixture of sadness and something that might have been warning. Behind the broken frame, wedged between the wardrobe and the wall, I glimpsed the corner of something leather-bound. My fingers worked against the tight space, skin scraping against rough wood, until I managed to extract a photo album I'd never seen before. The leather was old, cracked, and warm to the touch despite the apartment's chill. It fell open in my hands as if eager to reveal its secrets. The page it opened to stole the breath from my lungs. There I was, unmistakably me, standing in front of a house I'd never seen. The photograph was old-fashioned, with that sepia-tinted quality of images from decades past. But it was definitely my face, my build, my distinctive scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident. I was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, a dark suit that looked expensive but outdated, my hair styled in a way I'd never worn it. My hands shook as I turned the page, and the trembling only worsened with each new image. There I was again, sitting at a desk in an office with wood-paneled walls, surrounded by people in old-fashioned clothing. Another showed me standing next to a woman in a wedding dress, a woman I'd never met, her face radiant with joy as she looked up at me with obvious adoration. My own expression in the photograph was one of contentment, of belonging, emotions I'd felt rarely enough in my actual life to recognize their absence. The album contained dozens of photographs spanning what appeared to be years, maybe decades. Me at dinner parties, me playing what looked like a vintage piano, me walking through city streets that seemed familiar, yet impossibly foreign. In every image I looked older, more confident, more settled than I'd ever felt in reality. But most disturbing of all, I looked happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way that felt alien to my actual existence. I flipped backward through the pages, searching for some explanation, some clue that would make sense of this impossible collection. Near the beginning of the album, I found a photograph that made my blood freeze in my veins. It showed me as a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of the very apartment building where I now lived. But this couldn't be right. I'd grown up 3 states away, had never even visited the city until I moved here for work. The child in the photograph wore clothes I remembered owning, a striped shirt I'd loved until it became too small. But the building behind me was unmistakably this one, complete with the distinctive architectural details I'd grown familiar with over the past months. Even more unsettling, there was a woman standing in one of the apartment windows, a figure so small and distant that her features were impossible to make out. But her presence felt somehow significant, as if she were watching the child with intense interest. I slammed the album shut, my breathing rapid and shallow. The leather cover felt hot against my palms, almost feverish. The rational part of my mind struggled to find explanations. Photo manipulation, elaborate hoax, some kind of psychological experiment. But the images had possessed a quality of authenticity that was impossible to fake, a weight of reality that made my attempts at rationalization feel hollow and desperate. Standing slowly, I carried the album to my kitchen table, my movements mechanical, dreamlike. The fluorescent light overhead flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I opened the album again, this time starting from the first page. The earliest photograph showed an infant, unmistakably me, given the distinctive birthmark on my left shoulder that was clearly visible in the image. But I was being held by a woman I didn't recognize, in a hospital room that wasn't the one where I'd been born. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadows, but what I could see of her expression was one of fierce protectiveness, mixed with what looked like fear. As I progressed through the album, the photographs seemed to document an entire alternate life. Birthdays I'd never celebrated, achievements I'd never accomplished, relationships I'd never formed. There was a graduation ceremony from a university I'd never attended, wearing a cap and gown that should have been foreign, but somehow felt familiar against my skin just looking at the image. The woman from the wedding photograph appeared in many of the later images. In some, we were clearly a couple, holding hands, sharing intimate moments, looking at each other with the kind of deep affection that comes from years of shared history. In others, she seemed to be growing distant, her smiles becoming forced, her body language pulling away from mine. The final photographs featuring her showed us in what was obviously the midst of some kind of argument, though the silent images couldn't convey the nature of our dispute. But it was the very last page of the album that sent ice water coursing through my veins. The final photograph showed me, present-day me, wearing the exact clothes I'd put on yesterday, standing in my current apartment. I was looking directly at the camera with an expression of dawning horror, holding what appeared to be the very same photo album I now clutched in my hands. The image was crystal clear, recent, impossible. Behind me in the photograph, barely visible in the shadowy corner of my living room, stood a figure. The same woman from the early hospital photo, I realized with growing dread. She was older now, her hair gray, her face lined with age, but her eyes held the same fierce intensity. She was watching me examine the album, her expression unreadable but somehow deeply sad. I spun around, scanning every corner of my apartment, but found only empty shadows and the familiar arrangement of my furniture. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water, broken only by the rapid percussion of my heartbeat and the whisper of my shallow breathing. Returning to the photograph, I studied it with desperate intensity, searching for some sign of digital manipulation, some evidence that this was an elaborate trick. But every detail was perfect. The lighting, the shadows, the exact positioning of objects in my apartment. Even the coffee stain on my shirt from yesterday morning was clearly visible in the image. My hands moved without conscious direction, turning back through the pages of the album. But now the photographs seemed different, changed. In images where I had appeared alone, I could now make out faint figures in the backgrounds. Always the same woman, always watching, always present but separate. How had I missed her before? The apartment around me felt different now, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more concealing. The built-in wardrobe stood open like a mouth, its interior darkness absolute despite the overhead light. I had the distinct and growing sensation that I was being observed, that patient eyes were cataloging my every movement, my every expression of fear and confusion. I closed the album and held it against my chest, feeling its warmth seep through my shirt and into my skin. The leather seemed to pulse gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. When I looked around my apartment now, everything seemed slightly wrong. The angles a bit off, the proportions subtly distorted, as if I were seeing the space through a lens that couldn't quite focus properly. The rational explanations my mind had been frantically constructing collapsed like houses of cards. This wasn't a hoax or an elaborate joke. This wasn't photo manipulation or psychological experiment. The album was documenting a life I had somehow lived without living, experiences I had accumulated without experiencing. But if that was true, then what was this existence I remembered? What was this life I thought I was living? I found myself moving toward the bathroom mirror, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. My reflection looked back at me, familiar and foreign at the same time. The scar above my eyebrow was there, exactly as it appeared in the photographs. But something about my eyes seemed different. Older, sadder, as if they had witnessed events my conscious mind couldn't recall. Behind my reflection, barely visible in the mirror's depths, I caught a glimpse of movement. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was smiling. A sad, knowing smile that I wasn't making with my actual face. The album fell from my numb fingers, hitting the bathroom tiles with a sound like breaking bones. When I bent to retrieve it, the pages had fallen open to reveal a new photograph that hadn't been there before. It showed me in this exact moment, standing in my bathroom, looking down at the album on the floor, my face a mask of terror and confusion. And in the corner of this impossible new image, barely visible but undeniably present, stood the woman. She was reaching toward me, her expression one of infinite compassion and regret, as if she were trying to comfort someone who could neither see nor hear her. I backed away from the album, my shoulder blades hitting the bathroom wall with painful force. The fluorescent light above buzzed and flickered, casting my shadow in multiple directions at once. But among those shifting shadows, I could swear I saw others, darker shapes that moved independently, reaching toward me with what might have been sympathy or warning. The apartment fell silent except for my ragged breathing and the distant hum of electricity in the walls. But in that silence, I could almost hear something else, a whisper of movement, the suggestion of a presence that had always been there, waiting for me to finally notice. As I stood frozen in my bathroom, clutching the impossible album against my chest, one terrible certainty crystallized in my mind. Whatever life I thought I'd been living, whatever reality I believed I inhabited, it was only a fragment of something much larger and more complex. The photographs weren't documenting an alternate existence. They were showing me the truth I had somehow forgotten, or been made to forget. The woman in the images wasn't a stranger. She was someone who had been watching over me, protecting me, waiting for me to remember. But remember what? And why had that memory been taken from me in the first place? The album grew warm in my hands, and I realized with dawning terror that new pages were appearing, new photographs documenting events that hadn't happened yet. Events that showed me finally understanding, finally remembering, finally coming home. But whether that homecoming would be salvation or something far more complex and frightening, I no longer had the courage to discover. All I knew was that the life I thought I'd been living was ending, and whatever came next would require me to accept truths my mind had spent years trying to forget. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was my own reflection in the bathroom mirror, but I was no longer alone. The woman stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her eyes filled with a love so profound and patient that it broke my heart to finally recognize it. And in that moment of recognition, I understood that I had never been alone at all. Story 4. The house held its breath that morning, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to go wrong. I'd been awake since 5, lying in bed and listening to the familiar sounds of our old Victorian home settling into another day. The floorboards creaked their morning song, pipes gurgled their usual complaints, and somewhere in the distance, the neighbor's dog began its ritual barking at invisible threats. Everything seemed normal, reassuringly predictable, until I heard Sarah's footsteps on the hardwood floor above my bedroom. My sister had always been an early riser, but something about the rhythm of her movement struck me as odd. The steps were too deliberate, too measured, as if she were walking underwater or through thick honey. Each footfall seemed to echo longer than it should have, reverberating through the walls with an almost musical quality that made my skin crawl. I pulled myself from bed and padded down the hallway, my bare feet automatically avoiding the squeaky spots I'd memorized over 23 years of living in this house. The bathroom door at the end of the hall stood partially open, and I could see a sliver of yellow light spilling across the threshold. The sound of running water drifted toward me, but it wasn't the aggressive rush of a shower or the gentle trickle of someone washing their hands. It was something else entirely, a steady, rhythmic dripping that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I paused at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the worn banister that had been polished smooth by generations of my family's touch. From this vantage point, I could see Sarah's shadow moving behind the frosted glass of the bathroom door. The silhouette appeared normal enough, the familiar outline of my sister going through her morning routine. But something about the way the shadow shifted and flickered made my throat tighten with inexplicable anxiety. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill the entire hallway with its liquid percussion. I found myself counting the drops. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one hitting what sounded like porcelain with a crystalline ping that reverberated through my skull. The sound was so precise, so regular, that it began to feel less like water and more like a metronome keeping time for some cosmic performance I couldn't see. I decided to head downstairs and start the coffee, giving Sarah her privacy while fighting off the strange unease that had settled over me like a damp blanket. Our kitchen had always been the heart of the house, with its vintage yellow appliances and checkered linoleum floor that Mom had installed in the 70s and refused to replace. The morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that should have been comforting but somehow felt artificial, like stage lighting in a play where I'd forgotten my lines. As I went through the motions of preparing coffee, my ears remained tuned to the sounds from upstairs. The dripping continued, never varying in its rhythm, never stopping. I began to wonder what could possibly be dripping for so long. A leaky faucet? A wet towel hung carelessly over the shower rod? The sound seemed too consistent, too purposeful to be either of those things. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The coffee finished brewing, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, but the bathroom remained occupied. I poured myself a cup and sat at the small breakfast table by the window, watching the sun climb higher over our backyard. The oak tree that dominated our small lawn swayed gently in the morning breeze, its branches casting shifting shadows across the grass that seemed to writhe and dance with malevolent intent. That's when I heard the back door slam. The sound cracked through the morning air like a gunshot, causing me to spill hot coffee across my hand. I cursed under my breath and reached for a dish towel, my eyes fixed on the back door that I could see clearly from my position at the table. The door stood closed, its paint-chipped surface innocent and still, but I was certain I'd heard it slam. The sound had been too distinct, too immediate to be anything else. Moments later, I heard footsteps on the back porch, the familiar creak of the third board that had been loose for years. The steps moved toward the door, and I held my breath, waiting for it to open. When it did, Sarah stepped inside, looking exactly as she had the night before when she'd gone to bed. Her hair was tousled with sleep, her eyes slightly puffy, and she wore the same oversized t-shirt and pajama pants she'd had on when she'd said goodnight. She blinked at me with apparent confusion, running a hand through her tangled hair. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. I stared at her, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. I thought you were upstairs, in the bathroom." Sarah's brow furrowed, and she shook her head slowly. "I was sleeping in the backyard hammock. I came out here last night to look at the stars and must have dozed off." She yawned and stretched, every movement suggesting someone who had indeed spent the night outdoors. "Something woke me up, though. Sounded like a door slamming or something." My mouth went dry. The dripping sound from upstairs had stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on my eardrums. I set my coffee cup down with trembling fingers and forced myself to speak. "But I heard someone in the bathroom upstairs, water running. The door was closed." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Are you feeling okay? You look pale." She moved closer, and I could smell the outdoors on her, grass and dew and night air. "Maybe you were dreaming?" I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the rational explanation she offered, but the sound of that dripping water still echoed in my memory with crystalline clarity. No dream had ever felt that real, that persistent. I excused myself and walked upstairs on unsteady legs, Sarah following behind with growing worry evident in her voice. The bathroom door stood wide open now, revealing the small white-tiled space in all its mundane familiarity. The sink was dry, the shower stall empty, the toilet seat down. Everything appeared exactly as it should, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. A single navy blue towel hung over the shower rod, its fabric dark with moisture and dripping steadily onto the tiled floor below. Sarah stopped beside me, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. Neither of us had used that towel recently. It had been hanging there dry since the last time I'd done laundry 3 days ago. Yet now it hung heavy with water, each drop falling with the same rhythmic precision I'd been hearing for the past 20 minutes. "That's weird," Sarah murmured, but her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. She reached toward the towel, then stopped, her hand hovering inches from the soaked fabric. "It's freezing in here." She was right. The bathroom had become noticeably colder than the rest of the house, cold enough that our breath began to mist slightly in the air. The temperature difference was so dramatic it felt unnatural, as if someone had opened a window to a winter morning instead of the warm May day that waited outside. I stepped closer to the towel, and the dripping grew louder, more insistent. Each drop seemed to echo not just in the bathroom, but throughout the entire house, as if the sound were being amplified through the walls themselves. The wet fabric swayed slightly despite the absence of any breeze, and I could swear I saw the shape of handprints pressed into its surface. 2 distinct palm prints, as if someone had grabbed the towel with wet hands. Sarah backed away from the bathroom, her face pale and drawn. "We should call someone," she whispered, though neither of us could say exactly who we should call or what we should tell them. Over the following days, the incident with the towel became a persistent splinter in my mind. I found myself checking the bathroom obsessively, looking for signs of the inexplicable moisture that had soaked the fabric so thoroughly. Sarah seemed equally affected, though she refused to discuss what we'd witnessed beyond acknowledging that something unexplainable had occurred. The house began to feel different after that morning. Shadows lingered longer in corners where they had no right to exist. Sounds carried strangely through the walls. Whispers that might have been the wind, footsteps that could have been settling wood, and always, the memory of that rhythmic dripping that seemed to mock the very foundations of logic and reason. I started sleeping poorly, my dreams filled with images of wet towels and phantom sisters moving through spaces they couldn't possibly occupy. During my waking hours, I found myself questioning every sound, every movement, every seemingly normal occurrence. Was that really Sarah calling from downstairs? Or was it something else wearing her voice? When I saw her silhouette pass by a doorway, could I be certain it was actually her? The most disturbing part wasn't the supernatural implications of what had happened, but rather the growing suspicion that my own perception might be fundamentally unreliable. If I could so clearly see and hear someone who wasn't there, what else might I be experiencing that existed only in my mind? The thought terrified me more than any ghost or otherworldly presence could. Sarah seemed to sense my growing unease and suggested I see a doctor, perhaps speak to someone about stress or anxiety. Her concern felt genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back, some crucial piece of information about that morning that she didn't want to share. Sometimes I caught her staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, as if she were studying me for signs of something she feared to find. Weeks passed, and life took on a strange quality of forced normalcy. We went through our daily routines, had normal conversations, shared meals, and watched television together, but underneath it all ran a current of unspoken tension. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen again. And then, exactly 1 month after the incident with the towel, I woke early again to the sound of footsteps upstairs. The same measured pace, the same unnatural rhythm that had disturbed me before. My heart began to race as I recognized the familiar pattern of sounds: the running water, the dripping, the shadow moving behind the frosted bathroom door. This time, I didn't wait. I crept upstairs immediately, my bare feet finding their way through the darkness with practiced ease. The bathroom door was closed, yellow light spilling from beneath it, and the sound of dripping water filled the hallway with its liquid metronome. But this time, I was determined to understand what I was experiencing. I pressed my ear to the door and listened carefully. Beyond the dripping, I could hear something else. A soft, rhythmic breathing that seemed to synchronize with the water drops. In, drip, out, drip, in, drip, out, drip. The sound was hypnotic, almost peaceful, until I realized that the breathing pattern didn't quite match that of a human being. It was too slow, too deliberate, as if something were consciously controlling each inhalation and exhalation. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Part of me wanted to flee downstairs and pretend I'd heard nothing, but a larger part needed to understand what was happening in my own home. I turned the handle slowly, carefully, and pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The bathroom was empty, but the navy blue towel hung dripping over the shower rod, exactly as it had a month before. The rhythm of the water drops matched the breathing I'd heard, each drop falling precisely as an invisible chest might rise and fall. The air in the bathroom was frigid, cold enough that the mirror had fogged over completely, and in that condensation, I could see the faint outline of a handprint pressed against the glass from the inside. I heard a door slam downstairs. The sound jolted me back to reality, and I rushed to the window that overlooked our backyard. Sure enough, Sarah was walking up from the garden where she'd apparently spent another night sleeping under the stars. She looked up toward the house and waved when she saw me in the window, her smile bright and innocent in the morning light. I waved back automatically, but my mind reeled with the impossibility of what I was experiencing. If Sarah was outside, then what had I been hearing in the bathroom? Who or what had been breathing in rhythm with the dripping water? And why did these incidents only seem to occur when Sarah was sleeping in the backyard? As I stood there watching my sister approach the house, a terrible thought crept into my consciousness. What if the entity in the bathroom wasn't a separate presence at all? What if it was some part of Sarah that remained in the house while she slept outside, some projection or extension of her subconscious mind that I was somehow able to perceive? Or worse, what if my sister downstairs wasn't really Sarah at all, but rather the intruder, while the real Sarah was trapped somehow in that bathroom, trying to communicate through the only means available to her? The possibilities multiplied in my mind like fractals, each more unsettling than the last. I could no longer trust my own perceptions, could no longer distinguish between what was real and what might be a product of my deteriorating mental state. The house around me felt alive with hidden threats and impossible geometries. Every familiar corner now suspect, every ordinary sound potentially ominous. As Sarah entered through the back door and called up to ask if I wanted breakfast, I remained frozen at the bathroom window, staring at the dripping towel and the handprint on the mirror. The water continued its methodical descent, counting out seconds or heartbeats or some other measurement that existed beyond my understanding. I realized then that I might never know the truth about what was happening in our house. Perhaps the uncertainty itself was the point, the real horror lying not in the presence of something supernatural, but in the complete erosion of my ability to distinguish between reality and delusion. Whether the entity in the bathroom was real or imagined, whether my sister downstairs was truly Sarah or something else entirely, these questions would remain forever unanswered, leaving me suspended in a state of perpetual doubt. The dripping continued, marking time in a rhythm that belonged neither to this world nor entirely to my imagination, but to some liminal space between them, where truth and madness danced together in perfect, terrifying harmony. Story 5. The interstate stretched ahead like a concrete river frozen in time, brake lights bleeding red across 4 lanes of motionless traffic. I'd been sitting here for 23 minutes according to the digital clock on my dashboard, watching the temperature gauge creep steadily toward the danger zone, while my air conditioning wheezed against the suffocating August heat. That's when the honking started. Not the usual frustrated tap-tap-tap of rush hour impatience, but something more aggressive, insistent. The sound came from directly behind me, a sustained blast that made my shoulders tense and my grip tighten on the steering wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him, a bearded man in a red pickup truck, his face contorted with what looked like genuine rage. The truck itself seemed wrong somehow. The red paint appeared to pulse in the afternoon sun, shifting and undulating like it was alive. Heat waves, I told myself. Just heat waves rising from the superheated asphalt, creating optical illusions. But the explanation felt hollow even as I formed it. The honking stopped abruptly, replaced by the distinctive slam of a truck door. Through my side mirror, I watched the man emerge from his vehicle, something glinting in his right hand. A bottle. Dark glass, maybe beer, though I couldn't make out the label from this distance. He was walking toward my car. Every instinct screamed at me to lock my doors, but my fingers remained frozen on the wheel. The man's stride was purposeful, predatory, and as he approached, I could see his lips moving in what might have been words or might have been something else entirely. The bottle caught the sunlight, throwing fractured rainbows across my rear window. He raised his arm, the bottle arcing through the air toward my car, and I braced for impact. The glass exploded 6 inches from my trunk. Not against my car, not against anything visible. It simply burst apart in midair, as if crushed by an invisible fist. Crystal fragments scattered across the asphalt in a pattern too perfect to be natural, forming what almost looked like symbols before the wind scattered them. The man stopped walking. His mouth hung open, and for a moment his expression shifted from rage to something approaching terror. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the space where his bottle had disintegrated, then turned and jogged back to his truck. Traffic began moving again almost immediately. I drove the remaining 12 miles home in a fog of confusion and growing unease. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. The bottle had been defective, maybe old glass weakened by temperature changes, heat expansion, stress fractures, simple physics. But I couldn't shake the image of those fragments falling in their too perfect pattern, or the look of absolute fear that had replaced the man's anger. The house felt different when I arrived. Cooler, despite the failing air conditioning. Darker, though the sun wouldn't set for another 3 hours. I stood in my driveway for several minutes, keys heavy in my hand, studying the familiar angles of my home as if seeing them for the first time. The windows stared back at me with what felt like expectation. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and tried to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Stress fractures in glass were more common than people realized. Temperature differentials, manufacturing defects. The heat could have weakened the bottle's molecular structure, causing it to fail at precisely the wrong moment. But even as I constructed these explanations, another part of my mind kept returning to that moment of impossible destruction, and to the geometric pattern the fragments had formed before dispersing. The evening news mentioned a traffic jam on Interstate 85, but nothing about exploding bottles or road rage incidents. I found myself checking multiple news sources, scrolling through traffic reports and police blotters, searching for any mention of the bizarre event I'd witnessed. Nothing. Sleep came reluctantly that night, punctuated by dreams of shattering glass and geometric patterns traced in crystal. I woke several times convinced I'd heard something breaking, but each search of the house revealed nothing out of place. The next morning brought a new strangeness. My coffee mug cracked while I was drinking from it, a hairline fracture that appeared without warning and spread across the ceramic surface like a spider web. The mug was less than a year old, showing no previous signs of damage, yet it split apart in my hands as cleanly as if scored by a diamond cutter. I told myself it was coincidence. Thermal shock from the hot coffee meeting the cooler porcelain. But the crack pattern was too regular, too purposeful. It formed the same geometric design I'd seen in the scattered beer bottle fragments. Over the following days, the incidents multiplied. A picture frame in my living room developed a crack that ran in a perfect straight line from corner to corner. The bathroom mirror showed a small star-shaped fracture that hadn't been there the day before. A drinking glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, the pieces arranging themselves in that same unsettling pattern. I began paying attention to glass in ways I never had before. Windows, mirrors, screens, bottles. Every transparent surface seemed fragile, temporary, as if existing on the edge of destruction. I found myself moving carefully through my own home, afraid that any sudden movement might trigger another episode of spontaneous breakage. The paranoia crept in gradually. I started noticing how people looked at me in public spaces. The grocery store clerk's eyes lingered too long on my face. The gas station attendant watched me through the window with what seemed like suspicious interest. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who'd always been friendly, now offered only terse nods when we encountered each other. Were they seeing something I couldn't? Some sign of instability? Some indication that I was becoming dangerous? Or was I imagining their scrutiny entirely? The line between reality and perception began to blur. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, turning to find nothing there. Shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The house settled with sounds that suggested footsteps rather than normal structural adjustment. I researched glass fractures online, diving deep into technical articles about stress patterns and failure modes. The patterns I was seeing were consistent with something called tempered glass failure, where the entire surface shatters simultaneously due to internal stress. But that didn't explain why it was happening to non-tempered glass, or why the fragments consistently formed the same geometric arrangement. 3 weeks after the highway incident, I found myself back in traffic on Interstate 85. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning to the scene of my initial encounter, but my usual route to work had been blocked by construction. As I sat in the familiar frustration of motionless traffic, I found my eyes automatically searching for red pickup trucks. I found one. Same make, same model, same disturbing shade of red that seemed to pulse in the afternoon heat. The driver was a different man, younger, clean-shaven, but his expression carried the same inexplicable rage I'd seen weeks earlier. Our eyes met in my rearview mirror, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He reached for something on his passenger seat. Another bottle. The honking started. That same aggressive, sustained blast that bypassed my ears and went straight to some primal fear center in my brain. The man emerged from his truck, bottle in hand, advancing toward my car with the same predatory stride I remembered. This time, I was ready for what happened next. The bottle burst apart 3 feet from my rear bumper, fragments scattering in that impossible geometric pattern. But now I saw something else. A subtle distortion in the air around my car, like heat shimmer but cooler, more purposeful. It wrapped around my vehicle like a protective barrier, invisible except for the way it bent light and deflected the glass. The man backed away, his rage replaced by the same terror I'd seen before. But as he retreated, he said something that cut through the traffic noise and lodged itself in my consciousness like a splinter. He said my name. Not loudly, not shouting, just a whisper that somehow carried across the distance between us with perfect clarity. He spoke my full name, middle initial included, as if he'd known me for years. I'd never seen him before in my life. Traffic began moving, and I drove home on autopilot, my mind racing through possibilities, mistaken identity, coincidence. Maybe he'd seen my name on a credit card or mail in my car. But the explanation felt as fragile as the glass that kept breaking around me. That evening, I stood in my kitchen, studying my reflection in the microwave door. The man in the red truck had seemed to recognize me, but I felt like a stranger to myself. My eyes looked different, more alert, more wary. The lines around them had deepened, as if the stress of the past few weeks had accelerated the aging process. As I watched, a crack appeared in the microwave's glass door. Hairline thin at first, then expanding with mechanical precision. It spread in the familiar geometric pattern, dividing my reflection into fragments that no longer seemed to belong to the same person. I backed away from the appliance, my heart hammering against my ribs. The crack continued spreading until it covered the entire surface, turning the door into a spider web of fractured glass that somehow remained intact. In each fragment, my reflection looked slightly different. Older in some pieces, younger in others. In one shard, I appeared to be screaming, though I was making no sound. In another, my eyes were completely black, reflecting nothing. The fragments began to move. Not the glass itself, but the reflections within it. They shifted independently, each one showing a different version of myself engaged in different activities. One was writing at a desk, another was driving a car, a third stood in what looked like a hospital room, staring at something beyond the frame of the reflection. I understood then that the glass wasn't breaking randomly. It was showing me something. Multiple possibilities, multiple realities, all existing simultaneously, and separated only by transparent barriers that were becoming increasingly fragile. The question wasn't whether the protective barrier around my car was real or imagined. The question was which version of reality I was experiencing, and whether the glass fractures were showing me glimpses of the others. In one of the microwave fragments, I saw myself standing in the same kitchen, but the room looked different, cleaner, more organized. There were photos on the refrigerator that I didn't recognize, showing me with people I'd never met. In that reflection, I looked happier, more stable, more sane. In another fragment, the kitchen was dark and neglected. Dishes piled in the sink, newspapers scattered across the counter. The version of myself in that reflection looked haggard, desperate, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if being hunted. Which one was real? Which one was the delusion? The protective barrier, the geometric patterns, the synchronized braking. Were they evidence of some supernatural intervention, or symptoms of a mind fragmenting under stress? The distinction felt as fragile as the glass itself, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. I reached toward the microwave door, intending to touch the cracked surface, but stopped with my fingertip inches away. In the fragment directly in front of me, my reflection was shaking its head slowly, mouthing a single word over and over. Don't. The reflection seemed to be warning me against something, but I couldn't tell what. Don't touch the glass. Don't trust the visions. Don't try to distinguish between reality and hallucination. Or simply, don't. As if existence itself had become too dangerous to navigate without extreme caution. I lowered my hand and stepped back from the microwave, leaving the fractured door intact. The reflections continued their independent movements for several minutes before gradually settling back into static images of my actual position. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Interstate 85, punctuated occasionally by the aggressive honking of impatient drivers. Somewhere out there, another red pickup truck was probably approaching another stalled car. Another bottle was being raised in anger. Another moment of impossible destruction was about to unfold. The barrier that protected me, whether real or imagined, felt both comforting and terrifying. Protection implied the need for protection, which meant there was something out there worth fearing. But the most frightening possibility wasn't that the barrier was a delusion. It was that the barrier was real, and I had no idea what it was protecting me from, or what would happen when it finally shattered. Story 6. The smell hit me first, that peculiar mustiness of old paper mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I'd been working late at the university library again, lost in research for my dissertation on medieval manuscripts, when the fluorescent lights above began their familiar flicker dance that signaled closing time. Dr. Hendricks had given me special access to the restricted section in the basement, a maze of towering shelves that housed the university's most valuable and fragile texts. The air down here always felt different, thicker somehow, as if centuries of accumulated knowledge had given it weight. Tonight, that weight seemed particularly oppressive, pressing against my chest with each breath. I gathered my notes, the pages rustling like whispers in the silence. The basement had always made me slightly uneasy, but I'd attributed it to the isolation and the way shadows seemed to stretch longer between the stacks. Tonight, however, something felt fundamentally wrong. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. As I reached for my laptop bag, a soft thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the stacks. I froze, pen halfway to my mouth in that absent gesture I'd developed while thinking. The sound came again, followed by another, and another. Not quite rhythmic, but deliberate. Like footsteps, but softer. Like books falling. The logical part of my mind, the part trained in academic rigor and empirical observation, suggested that old buildings settle, that books sometimes shift on overstuffed shelves. But my instincts, those primitive warning systems that had kept my ancestors alive, were screaming something entirely different. I called out a tentative hello, my voice swallowed by the dense rows of volumes. The response was immediate, a cascade of sounds, dozens of soft impacts, as if my voice had triggered an avalanche. But these weren't the random crashes of falling objects. They were too controlled, too purposeful. Moving toward the sounds, I passed familiar landmarks. The section on Byzantine history, the locked case containing illuminated manuscripts worth more than my yearly stipend. the narrow aisle where I'd spent countless hours hunched over crumbling texts. With each step, the air grew thicker, and that strange, sweet smell intensified. Then I saw them. Books were moving, not falling, moving. Hardcover volumes were gliding off shelves on opposite sides of the aisle, floating across the narrow space with the deliberate grace of birds in formation. They weren't obeying gravity so much as ignoring it, traveling in gentle arcs that defied everything I understood about physics. As I watched, frozen in fascination and terror, they began to stack themselves in the center of the aisle. One by one, they settled into place with soft whispers of leather against leather. Medieval illuminations of northern France, the architecture of Gothic cathedrals, transcendental philosophy in the 12th century. Each volume found its place in the growing tower with mechanical precision, as if guided by invisible hands that knew exactly where each book belonged. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Earthquake tremors, air pressure changes, magnetic fields. But even as I grasped for these logical anchors, I watched a leather-bound tome on Gregorian chant complete a perfect 90-degree turn in midair to align its spine with the others. The tower grew steadily, reaching my waist, then my chest. The books continued their impossible dance, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't random selections. These were books I'd worked with, books I'd requested from the archives, books that had passed through my hands over the past months. The sweet smell was stronger now, cloying and artificial, like the perfume that funeral homes use to mask other odors. When the last book settled into place, a slim volume on monastic scribal traditions that I'd cited heavily in Chapter 3, the silence returned with crushing intensity. The tower reached nearly to my shoulders, completely blocking the aisle. It was the only way out of this section. I approached slowly, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The spines faced outward in perfect alignment, their gold-embossed titles catching the weak fluorescent light. As my eyes traced the stack from bottom to top, a chill spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. The first letters of each title, read from bottom to top, spelled out my name, M-A-R-C-U-S. Medieval illuminations of northern France, the architecture of Gothic cathedrals, Renaissance patronage in Florence, Chronicles of Charlemagne, Understanding Scholastic Philosophy, Studies in 13th Century Monasticism. 6 books, 6 letters, my name, spelled out in the language of academia that had consumed my life for the past 4 years. My hands trembled as I reached for the top volume. The leather was warm, warmer than it should have been after sitting in the climate-controlled basement. As I lifted it, I half expected resistance, some supernatural force holding it in place. Instead, it came away easily, almost eagerly, as if it wanted to be moved. Studies in 13th Century Monasticism. I'd never seen this book before tonight, though somehow I wasn't surprised to find it here. The university's collection was vast and new acquisitions appeared regularly, but as I opened the cover, my breath caught. The library checkout card in the front pocket was filled with dates and signatures. All the signatures were mine. All the dates were from the past 6 months. But I had no memory of ever checking out this book. I set it aside with careful deliberation and reached for the next volume. Understanding Scholastic Philosophy. Another book I didn't recognize. Another checkout card filled with my handwriting, documenting a relationship with this text that existed only in the library's records. One by one, I dismantled the tower. With each book removed, the sweet smell grew stronger, and the silence became more oppressive. The fluorescent lights above seemed to dim, though that might have been my imagination, or my eyes adjusting to something that was getting darker. Every volume told the same impossible story. Months of checkouts in my name, books I'd supposedly studied extensively, research I had no memory of conducting. The handwriting was definitely mine. I recognized the particular way I formed my R's, the slight leftward slant that developed when I wrote quickly. But the person who had signed these cards was a stranger to me. As the tower diminished, new details emerged. Margin notes in my handwriting filled the pages of texts I'd never opened. Passages were highlighted in the yellow marker I always carried. Bookmark ribbons were placed at exactly the pages I would have marked for reference. It was as if someone had been living my academic life in parallel, making all the same choices, pursuing all the same research threads, but doing it in books I'd never seen. The final book, Medieval Illuminations of Northern France, felt different in my hands. Heavier than it should have been, and somehow more solid, as if it existed more fully than the others. When I opened it, a piece of paper fell out. Not old parchment or academic notepaper, but ordinary white printer paper, the kind we used in the computer lab upstairs. In my handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it, was a single line. The library remembers what you choose to forget. The words hit me like cold water. I stared at the note, at the familiar loops and angles of my own script, trying to summon any memory of writing those words. Nothing came. The basement around me seemed to pulse gently, as if the building had a heartbeat I was only now noticing. I looked around the cleared aisle, at the empty shelves where the books had originated. They gaped like missing teeth, their shadows deeper than they should have been in the fluorescent light. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. It reminded me of something specific, something I should remember, but couldn't quite grasp. My phone had no signal down here. It never did. But the timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. The library had been closed for nearly 2 hours. Dr. Hendricks would have made his final rounds, checking that all the students had left. He would have seen my car in the parking lot and assumed I'd found another way home. No one would be looking for me until morning. I gathered the 6 books, stacking them carefully in my arms. They were warm against my chest, and I could swear I felt a faint vibration through their covers, like a cat's purr or a distant engine. As I climbed the stairs toward the main floor, the sensation grew stronger, and the sweet smell began to fade. The main library was dark except for the emergency exit signs, their red glow painting the empty reading tables in shades of blood. My footsteps echoed differently up here, sharper and more isolated. Through the tall windows, I could see the campus quad, empty and peaceful under the streetlights. Normal, rational. A world where books stayed on shelves and academic records didn't rewrite themselves. I signed out at the front desk, my hand moving automatically through the familiar routine. The duty log showed I'd signed in at 6:30 p.m., just as I remembered. But above my entry, in the same handwriting, was another signature from earlier that day. My name again, with a check-in time of 2:15 p.m. I had been in class at 2:15 p.m. I remembered the lecture on paleographic dating techniques, remembered taking notes on Professor Walsh's discussion of ink analysis. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, free of that cloying sweetness that had filled the basement. I loaded the books into my backpack and walked to my car, each step feeling like a return to sanity. The keys were in my pocket where they belonged. The engine started on the first try. Everything was normal, but as I drove through the empty streets toward my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Not from the shadows or the empty buildings I passed, but from somewhere closer. From the backpack on my passenger seat, where 6 impossible books waited to reveal their secrets. At home, I spread the volumes across my kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. In the familiar surroundings of my small apartment, they looked perfectly ordinary. Old academic texts, the kind I worked with every day. Their checkout cards told stories I couldn't remember, but perhaps that wasn't so unusual. Graduate school was a blur of research and deadlines. Maybe I had checked out these books. Maybe the stress of dissertation writing was affecting my memory more than I'd realized. I opened my laptop and began to search the university's online catalog for each title. They were all there, all properly cataloged, all showing my name as the most recent borrower. According to the system, I had an excellent relationship with these texts. I was apparently quite the dedicated scholar. But when I tried to access my personal research files, looking for any notes or citations that might jog my memory, I found gaps. Entire folders that should have contained my work were empty. Months of research had vanished from my computer. leaving only the faint outlines of deleted files that specialized software might be able to recover. I spent the next 3 hours going through every document on my hard drive, every email in my account, every notebook in my desk drawer. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible. I had been conducting extensive research using books I'd never seen, writing papers I couldn't remember, pursuing academic threads that felt foreign to me. It was as if someone else had been living my life, making my choices, doing my work. The worst part wasn't the impossibility of it all. The worst part was how good the work was. The notes I couldn't remember taking were insightful and thorough. The research I didn't recall doing was exactly what my dissertation needed. This other version of myself, this Marcus who could check out books without remembering, was a better scholar than I had ever been. As dawn light began to creep through my kitchen window, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I would return to the library. I would go back to that basement and find out what was happening to me, because the alternative, accepting that my mind was fragmenting, that I was losing pieces of myself to some psychiatric condition, was more frightening than any supernatural explanation. The books sat on my table like sleeping animals, their warm weight a reminder that some experiences resist rational explanation. In a few hours, the library would open again, and I would walk back into that basement with its thick air and expectant silence. I would look for answers in the stacks where books moved like living things and checkout cards rewrote themselves. But first, I had to decide, did I want to remember what this other Marcus had been doing? Or was there a reason I had forgotten? The note in my handwriting suggested that forgetting was a choice, not an accident. Perhaps there were some memories the conscious mind wasn't meant to carry. Outside my window, the campus was waking up. Students would soon fill the paths between buildings, carrying their backpacks and their certainties about how the world worked. They would study in the library's bright reading rooms, never venturing into the basement where knowledge took on a life of its own. I envied them their ignorance. But I was no longer one of them. I was someone who had seen books fly through the air to spell his name. I was someone who lived a double life in the stacks below ground. I was someone who had chosen to forget, and now had to choose whether to remember. The 6 books waited silently for my decision, warm and patient and full of secrets that might be better left buried in the basement darkness where memory goes to hide. Story 7. The first time I heard Marcus laugh, I thought someone had broken into my house. It was 3 weeks after Robert gave me the bird, a housewarming gift for my new place on Elm Street, though I suspected it was more about getting rid of the thing than any genuine gesture of friendship. Marcus was beautiful, I'll admit, an African gray with silver-tipped feathers that caught the late afternoon light streaming through my living room windows. His eyes were the color of old amber, intelligent and watchful in a way that made me uncomfortable when I caught him staring. But it was the laughter that got to me. Not the typical squawks or mimicked words you'd expect from a parrot. This was human laughter. Deep, throaty, genuinely amused. The kind of laugh that suggested someone had just heard the punchline to a joke I wasn't part of. The strange thing was, it only happened when I was alone. Those first few weeks I'd be reading or working on my laptop, the house settling into its evening quiet, when that sound would drift from the corner where Marcus's cage sat. A low chuckle at first, then building into something that made my skin crawl. I'd look up to find him perched silently, head tilted, watching me with those unblinking amber eyes. I started keeping a notebook, documenting the laughter. Tuesday, 8:47 p.m. Thursday, 11:23 p.m. Always when I was alone, always when the house felt most empty. When my sister visited last month, I waited hopefully for Marcus to perform his disturbing trick, but he remained silent as stone, occasionally preening his feathers or shifting on his perch. "He's gorgeous," Sarah had said, approaching the cage. "What does he say?" Nothing. Not a sound. After she left, I stood in front of the cage, arms crossed. "Why won't you laugh for her?" Marcus tilted his head, studying me with that unsettling intelligence. Then, as if responding to my question, he let out a low chuckle that raised every hair on my arms. The laughter began changing in the third week. What had started as isolated chuckles evolved into longer episodes. Sometimes it sounded like multiple voices laughing together, a cacophony of amusement that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. I'd spin around, searching for speakers hidden behind furniture, convinced someone was playing an elaborate prank. But there was never anyone there, just Marcus, watching me with what I swear looked like amusement. I started avoiding the living room in the evenings, taking my laptop to the bedroom, eating dinner at the kitchen table instead of on the couch. But sound travels in old houses, and even from upstairs, I could hear the laughter drifting through the vents. It followed me like smoke, seeping under doors and through cracks in the walls. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed, listening to the house creak and settle, waiting for that sound. When it came, and it always came, it seemed closer than before. Not echoing from downstairs, but right there in the room with me. I checked the hallway, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, hoping to catch Marcus in the act. The living room was dark, moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. The cage sat in its usual corner, covered with the dark cloth I'd started draping over it each night. As I approached, the laughter began, soft at first, then building to that familiar chorus of voices. But the cage was silent. No movement, no rustling of feathers. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like I was standing in the center of an invisible crowd. I yanked the cloth away. The cage was empty. My hands shook as I examined the latch. It was still secured, locked tight as I'd left it. The water dish was full, the seed cup untouched, but Marcus was gone. Marcus? My voice cracked in the darkness. Where are you? The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. I swept the flashlight across the room, searching corners and shadows. Behind the couch, under the coffee table, anywhere a bird might hide. Nothing. Then I saw the feathers. Just 3 of them at first, silver gray against the hardwood floor. They led from the cage toward the hallway, a trail so faint I almost missed it. I followed them like breadcrumbs, my flashlight beam dancing across more scattered feathers. Past the kitchen, up the stairs, down the second-floor hallway. The trail ended at the attic door. I stared at the heavy wooden door, its brass handle tarnished with age. When I'd moved in, the realtor had mentioned the attic was locked, the key lost years ago. The previous owner had sealed it up after some kind of water damage, she'd said. Not worth the trouble of breaking in, but there were feathers scattered at the base of the door. Fresh ones, still carrying the faint scent of preening oil. I reached for the handle, not expecting anything. It turned easily in my hand. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness above. Cold air rushed down, carrying with it the musty smell of old wood and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made my nose wrinkle. Marcus? I called softly. From somewhere far above came the sound of movement. Not the flutter of wings, but something heavier. Deliberate footsteps crossing a wooden floor. Human footsteps. My rational mind supplied explanations. Settling house, expanding wood, mice in the walls. But my body knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to close the door, to go back to my bedroom and pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, I started up the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as I climbed, and the smell intensified, like wet earth and decay, underlaid with something sickly sweet. My flashlight beam revealed water stains on the walls, dark patches that looked almost like handprints in the weak light. The stairs ended at another door, this one slightly ajar. Light leaked through the gap, not electric light, but something warmer, flickering like candlelight. I pressed my eye to the opening. The attic was larger than I'd expected, stretching the full length of the house. Candles sat in makeshift holders scattered across the floor, their flames dancing in unfelt breezes. The walls were covered with what looked like photographs, though from my limited vantage point, I couldn't make out the subjects. And there, in the center of the room, was a chair. Someone was sitting in it, their back to me. The figure was perfectly still, head tilted at an odd angle. For a moment I thought it might be a mannequin. The posture was too rigid, too unnatural for a living person. Then it laughed. The same laugh I'd been hearing for weeks, but clearer now, unfiltered by walls and distance. It was definitely human, definitely real, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too long, too knowing, like the person understood something I didn't. I pushed the door open wider, my flashlight beam joining the candlelight to illuminate more of the space. The photographs on the walls weren't photographs at all. They were mirrors, dozens of them, all different sizes and shapes, reflecting the candlelight in a dizzying array of angles and shadows. The figure in the chair didn't turn around. "Marcus?" My voice was barely a whisper. The laughter stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. The figure remained motionless, and I realized with growing dread that I couldn't see it breathing at all. I took a step forward, then another. The floorboards creaked under my feet, unnaturally loud in the quiet space. The mirrors seemed to track my movement, each reflection showing me from a slightly different angle, creating the illusion of a crowd watching my approach. When I was close enough to touch the chair, I finally saw what was sitting in it. It was me. Not a twin or a look-alike. Me. Down to the same flannel pajamas I was wearing, the same 3-day stubble, the same scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. The other me sat perfectly still, eyes closed, mouth curved in a slight smile. I reached out with a trembling hand, and my reflection in the nearest mirror did the same. But the figure in the chair didn't move. It was like looking at a photograph of myself, frozen in time. Then its eyes opened. They were amber. The same amber as Marcus's eyes, ancient and knowing and completely wrong in my own face. The smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. And then it laughed. Not with my voice this time, but with that same chorus I'd been hearing for weeks. Multiple voices overlapping, harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords couldn't achieve. The sound filled the attic, bounced off the mirrors, surrounded me completely. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam swinging wildly across the walls. In each mirror, I saw myself, but not quite myself. In one, my eyes were amber. In another, my smile was too wide. A third showed me with feathers growing from my scalp like hair. The laughter grew louder, more insistent. I turned and ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, not caring if I fell. Behind me, the laughter followed, echoing down the narrow staircase like water rushing through a pipe. I slammed the attic door shut and leaned against it, gasping. The brass handle turned under my weight, and I heard the decisive click of a lock engaging. When I tried the handle again, it wouldn't budge. The house was silent. I stood there for several minutes, listening to my own heartbeat gradually slow. The rational explanations crept back in. Hallucination? Stress? Carbon monoxide leak? I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. The mind could play terrible tricks when pushed beyond its limits. When I finally went back to the living room, Marcus was in his cage. He perched calmly on his favorite branch, preening his feathers as if nothing had happened. The cage was properly latched, the water dish half empty now. He looked up when I entered, tilting his head in that familiar gesture. "Where were you?" I asked. Marcus studied me for a long moment. Then, in a perfect imitation of my own voice, he said, "I never left." The words were clear, distinct, unmistakably in my own cadence and tone. But I'd never taught him to say that. I'd never said those words in his presence. I grabbed the cloth and threw it over the cage, my hands shaking. "No more," I muttered. "No more of this." From beneath the cloth came a soft chuckle. Not quite Marcus's laugh, not quite mine. Something caught between the two, as if 2 voices were trying to speak through the same throat. That was 3 days ago. The laughter has stopped since then, replaced by something worse. Silence. Marcus sits in his cage, perfectly still, watching me with those amber eyes. He doesn't eat, doesn't drink, doesn't make a sound. But sometimes when I catch my reflection in the window or the bathroom mirror, I swear my eyes look different. More amber than brown. More knowing than they should be. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I find myself wondering, if that thing in the attic chair was me, then who am I? I've been avoiding mirrors since then. Avoiding anything that might show me my own reflection. Because I'm starting to suspect that the answer to that question isn't one I want to know. The attic door remains locked. I've checked it several times just to be sure. But sometimes I hear movement up there. Footsteps crossing the floor, the creak of that chair. And sometimes, if I press my ear to the door, I can hear laughing. It sounds like my voice now, but I'm not the one making the sound. I think I know what Robert was really trying to get rid of when he gave me Marcus, and I think it's too late to give him back. Story 8. The smell hits me first. That unmistakable blend of Turkish tobacco and Old Spice aftershave that clung to Grandpa's clothes like a second skin. I freeze on the living room sofa, my evening news program flickering forgotten in the background, and draw in a deeper breath through my nose. The scent is so vivid, so immediate, that for a moment I expect to see him shuffling through the doorway in his worn leather slippers, muttering about the government or the weather or whatever had captured his ire that particular day. But Grandpa's been dead for 3 months. I force myself to exhale slowly, rationally. Old houses hold smells, I tell myself. The cigarette smoke from his 40-year habit probably soaked into every fiber of this place, every crack in the plaster, every thread in the upholstery. The fact that I inherited his house doesn't mean I inherited his ghost. The logical explanation sits heavy in my mind, but it does nothing to ease the sudden chill that races down my spine. That's when I notice the hat. His Panama hat, the one with the sweat-stained band and the slightly frayed brim, hangs motionless by the kitchen doorway, perfectly positioned, as if he'd just walked in from his evening constitutional around the neighborhood and hung it on the old brass hook that used to be mounted there. Except there is no hook. I removed it myself 2 weeks ago when I started cleaning out his things, frustrated by the way it caught on my shoulder every time I passed through the narrow doorway. The hat simply floats in space, suspended by nothing I can see. My rational mind scrambles for explanations. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or fishing line. Maybe some movers or relatives played a prank before I officially moved in last week. But even as I consider these possibilities, I can't quite convince myself. The hat hangs with a subtle weight to it, the way fabric behaves when gravity pulls it earthward. There's no telltale glint of transparent thread, no unusual shadows that might explain the illusion. I approach slowly, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor that Grandpa spent so many Saturday mornings polishing to a mirror shine. The closer I get, the more solid the hat appears. The Panama straw shows every familiar imperfection. The small tear near the crown, where a branch caught it during one of his gardening sessions. The particular way the brim curved from years of his fingers adjusting it against the sun. My hand reaches out instinctively, and the moment my fingers make contact with the rough straw, the hat drops. It falls exactly as physics demands, landing with a soft thump on the kitchen linoleum. No supernatural floating, no otherworldly resistance. Just a hat, behaving like a hat should. But the cigarette smell grows stronger. I bend to pick up the Panama, and the scent washes over me with such intensity that my eyes water. It's not the stale, settled odor of old smoke embedded in fabric. This is fresh, immediate. As if someone had just stubbed out a lucky strike in the ceramic ashtray that used to sit on Grandpa's TV tray, the one I'd thrown away along with the hook. Standing there in the kitchen doorway, his hat in my hands, I feel a presence behind me. Not the vague sense of being watched that sometimes creeps up in empty houses, but something specific and intentional. The feeling of someone standing close enough that their breath might tickle the back of my neck. someone whose familiar cologne mingles with tobacco smoke to create a scent signature I'd recognize anywhere. I turn around slowly. The living room stretches empty before me, exactly as I left it. The television still murmurs its evening programming, casting shifting blue light across the furniture. Nothing has moved. No one is there. But the presence doesn't fade. If anything, it intensifies, as if my acknowledgement of it has given it permission to press closer. The floorboards above my head creak. It's his bedroom up there. Was his bedroom. The place where he spent his final weeks, too weak from the emphysema to venture downstairs except for meals and medication. I'd been meaning to clean it out, to sort through his clothes and personal effects, but something had kept me from climbing those stairs since I moved in. Not sentiment exactly, but a reluctance I couldn't quite name. Another creak, longer and more deliberate. The sound of weight shifting from one foot to another. I find myself at the bottom of the staircase without remembering the decision to move. My hand rests on the banister, the same banister Grandpa had gripped so tightly in his final months, leaving permanent indentations in the soft pine from his arthritic fingers. The wood feels warm under my palm, warmer than the ambient temperature of the house should allow. The creaking above continues in a rhythm I recognize. 3 steps toward the window, pause, 3 steps back toward the dresser. It's the exact pattern Grandpa followed during his sleepless nights when the breathing became too difficult for lying down. I'd listened to that same sequence countless times during my visits, the sound drifting down through the old house's thin walls and floors. But there's no one up there. No one living anyway. I climb the stairs. Each step triggers its own protest from the aged wood, a symphony of squeaks and groans that seems unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. The sound above my head stops the moment I begin my ascent, as if whoever, whatever, is up there has paused to listen to my approach. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretches longer than I remember, dim and narrow in the dying light that filters through the single window at the far end. Grandpa's bedroom door stands slightly ajar, just as I left it after my last visit. But something about the darkness beyond that threshold feels different now, denser somehow, as if it's been compressed by an invisible weight. I push the door open. The room looks exactly as it should. The bed sits unmade, sheets and blankets twisted from his restless final nights. His dresser stands against the far wall, its surface cluttered with prescription bottles and reading glasses, and the accumulated debris of a long life. The rocking chair by the window holds the same rumpled cardigan he'd worn during our last conversation, when he'd tried to tell me something important about the house but kept losing his train of thought to coughing fits. But the air in here moves wrong. Instead of the stillness I expect in a closed room, there's circulation, subtle but distinct, as if someone is breathing, their chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep, or the labored pattern of someone struggling with damaged lungs. I step into the room and immediately wish I hadn't. The temperature drops noticeably, not the gradual cooling of evening settling in, but an abrupt shift that raises goosebumps along my arms. The breathing sound becomes more pronounced, though I can't pinpoint its source. It seems to emanate from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. Then I see the depression in the mattress. A clear outline presses into the old springs, exactly the size and shape of a human body. As I watch, the impression shifts slightly, the way it might if someone lying there had adjusted their position. The pillows at the head of the bed bear the unmistakable indentation of a head, complete with the particular pattern Grandpa's thinning hair had created during his final weeks. My throat constricts, and not just from fear. The smell of cigarettes has followed me upstairs, but now it mingles with other scents. Antiseptic from long ago medical visits, the musty odor of old age, and underneath it all, something else. Something that reminds me of earth and darkness and the particular mustiness that clings to things that have been buried. The rocking chair begins to move. Slowly at first, just the faintest motion back and forth, as if stirred by a breeze that doesn't exist. But the movement builds momentum, the old wood creaking in its familiar rhythm. The cardigan slides slightly with each rock, the way it might if arms were moving within its sleeves. I back toward the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. This isn't grief or imagination, or the power of suggestion. This is something else entirely, something that defies every rational explanation I can construct. But even as terror floods my system, another part of my mind notices details that don't quite fit the supernatural narrative. The house is old. Old houses settle and shift, their joints expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Floorboards creak without human weight to trigger them. Rocking chairs can be set in motion by vibrations traveling through the wooden frame of the building. Memory foam mattresses and old springs retain impressions long after pressure is removed. I'm grasping at straws, and I know it. But the alternative, accepting what my eyes and ears and nose are telling me, requires a fundamental revision of everything I believe about reality. The breathing grows louder. It's definitely coming from the bed now, from the depression in the mattress that's growing more pronounced by the moment. The sound carries that familiar wheeze, the wet rattle that had become Grandpa's constant companion in his final weeks. But there's something else mixed in with the respiratory distress, an attempt at communication, as if whoever is producing these sounds wants desperately to speak, but lacks the breath to form words. I find myself leaning closer, straining to hear what might be hidden in those labored exhalations. The rational part of my mind screams warnings, but curiosity proves stronger than self-preservation. If this is real, if Grandpa somehow lingers in this house, maybe he's trying to tell me something important. Maybe there's unfinished business, some crucial information he needs to convey. The breathing stops abruptly. In the sudden silence, I become hyper-aware of my own respiration, my own heartbeat, the blood rushing through my ears. The depression in the mattress begins to fade, the springs slowly returning to their original position. The rocking chair settles into stillness. Even the cigarette smell starts to dissipate, as if a window has been opened to clear the air. But I haven't moved. I'm still standing in the doorway, frozen between flight and a curiosity that borders on compulsion. The room feels empty now, truly empty, but something about that emptiness seems temporary. A pause rather than an ending. Then I hear it, a voice calling my name from downstairs. Not a shout or a cry for help, but the familiar cadence Grandpa used when he wanted my attention. The same tone he'd employed during my childhood visits when he'd call me in from the backyard for dinner, or to help with some household task. My name rises through the floorboards with perfect clarity, impossible to mistake for wind or settling wood or the neighbor's television. I should run. Every instinct I possess screams that I should leave this house immediately, drive to the nearest hotel, and never return. But the voice carries such warmth, such gentle invitation, that I find myself moving toward the staircase instead of away from it. Whatever is happening here, it doesn't feel malevolent. Unsettling, certainly, impossible to rationalize, but not evil. At least, that's what I tell myself as I descend the stairs. The living room has changed in my absence. Subtle differences that I might have missed if I weren't so hyper-alert to every detail. The television volume has been turned down to barely audible. The throw pillows on the sofa have been rearranged into the precise configuration Grandpa preferred during his evening news viewing. Most significantly, his old TV tray has been repositioned beside his favorite chair. The recliner I'd moved to the corner because I preferred the sofa. And there's a fresh cigarette burning in an ashtray that definitely wasn't there before. The Lucky Strike sits perfectly balanced on the ceramic rim, its ember glowing bright orange in the dim room. Smoke rises in a thin, steady stream, undisturbed by any air current. The sight is so mundane, so perfectly ordinary, that it takes me a moment to process the impossibility of it. I approach the ashtray with the same slow caution I'd used upstairs. The cigarette appears completely normal. The familiar red and white package design, the particular way Grandpa had always positioned them with the filter resting against the groove in the ceramic. But cigarettes don't light themselves. People don't materialize from nothing to smoke them, unless they do. As I lean closer to examine the impossible Lucky Strike, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. Not dramatic or startling, just the subtle shift of fabric settling. I turn my head slowly, and there in the recliner, in Grandpa's chair, I see the faint outline of a human form. Not solid exactly, but substantial enough to register against the worn upholstery. A translucent impression that might be a trick of the light, except that it moves with the rhythm of breathing. The same labored pattern I'd heard upstairs, but quieter now, more peaceful. As if the struggle for air has eased somehow. Fear wars with wonder in my chest. This is either the most vivid hallucination I've ever experienced, or I'm witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. Either way, I'm standing in my grandfather's living room watching a ghost smoke a cigarette in his favorite chair, while the evening news plays at barely audible volume. The outline in the chair shifts slightly, and I could swear I see the suggestion of a hand lifting toward where a mouth might be. The cigarette in the ashtray grows shorter with each invisible draw, its ember brightening and dimming in perfect synchronization with the breathing sounds. I want to speak, to ask the questions that have been building in my mind since this began. What are you trying to tell me? Why are you here? What happened in those final moments that I missed, arriving too late to hear your last words? But my throat feels constricted, my voice locked somewhere deep in my chest. Instead, I simply watch. The cigarette burns down slowly, methodically, exactly the way Grandpa had always smoked. Never rushing, never wasting. The outline in the chair becomes gradually more distinct, as if my acceptance of its presence has given it permission to solidify. I can almost make out facial features now, the familiar slope of his shoulders, the way he held his head slightly tilted when he was thinking. But just as the image begins to feel truly real, it starts to fade. The cigarette reaches its filter and extinguishes itself with a tiny hiss. The breathing sounds grow fainter, more distant. The outline in the chair becomes transparent again, then disappears entirely. I'm alone once more, standing in a living room that contains nothing but furniture and the lingering smell of tobacco smoke. The rational explanations crowd back into my mind with renewed force. Grief hallucinations are well-documented phenomena. The stress of inheriting property, of sorting through a loved one's possessions, can trigger complex psychological responses. Carbon monoxide from an old furnace might cause confusion and sensory distortions. There are countless ways to explain what I think I've experienced without invoking the supernatural. But as I stare at the ashtray with its still warm cigarette butt, I realize that explanations don't matter. Whether this is grief or gas leak or genuine ghostly visitation, the experience itself remains unchanged. I've spent the evening in conversation with my grandfather's memory, or presence, and that conversation feels far from finished. I walk to the kitchen and retrieve his Panama hat from where I'd dropped it earlier. The straw feels solid and real in my hands, still carrying that faint scent of his cologne. I carry it back to the living room and hang it carefully on the non-existent hook by the doorway. It stays exactly where I place it. As I turn off the television and prepare for bed in a house that may or may not be empty, I find myself wondering if I'm losing my mind or finding something I didn't know I'd lost. The question feels less important than it should. What matters is that tomorrow evening, I'll sit on this sofa again. I'll wait for the smell of cigarettes and the sight of that hat hanging in impossible space. And maybe, if I'm very still and very quiet, I'll hear him call my name again. The house settles around me as I climb the stairs to the guest bedroom, its old bones creaking in patterns that might be random or might be deliberate. I no longer care which. Some conversations, I'm beginning to understand, transcend the boundaries of life and death. Some presences refuse to be dismissed by logic or fear. As I reach the top of the stairs, I hear one final sound from below. The soft scrape of a chair being moved across the floor, positioned just so for optimal viewing of tomorrow night's news. The sound is followed by a contented sigh, barely audible but unmistakably satisfied. I fall asleep to the rhythm of breathing that might be my own, or might belong to someone who's been waiting patiently for me to come home. Story 9. The Delacroix house had always smelled of old wood and lavender, but today it reeked of something else entirely, something metallic and sharp that caught in the back of my throat like a fishhook. I stood in the doorway of the parlor, my dress shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, in a rhythm that seemed too loud for a house supposed to be draped in respectful silence. Uncle Matthias lay in his mahogany casket at the far end of the room, waxy and still, but my eyes kept drifting upward to the wine barrel suspended from the ceiling beams. It had been there for as long as I could remember, a relic from the old days when this place had been a working vineyard. The thing was massive, easily 6 feet across, its dark oak staves bound with iron hoops that had rusted to the color of dried blood. I'd always wondered why they'd never taken it down. The parlor buzzed with the low murmur of relatives and family friends, their voices creating a constant drone that should have been comforting, but instead felt like insects crawling under my skin. Aunt Delphine moved between the groups with practiced grace, accepting condolences with the same mechanical nod she'd been using for the past 3 hours. Grandmother Celeste sat in her wheelchair near the casket, rosary beads sliding through her gnarled fingers with metronomic precision. I'd been back in Louisiana for less than 2 days, and already the oppressive humidity felt like it was pressing against my skull. The air conditioning wheezed through the old vents, fighting a losing battle against the late summer heat that seemed to seep through the very walls of the house. Something creaked overhead. The sound was subtle, almost lost beneath the conversations, but it made me pause. I tilted my head back, studying the barrel more carefully. The iron hoops looked solid enough, but there was something about the way the light hit the wood that bothered me. Dark stains radiated from between the staves, creating patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had painted symbols I couldn't quite decipher. A hand touched my shoulder, and I jerked away instinctively. Cousin Marie stood beside me, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She'd always been the nervous type, but today, she looked genuinely rattled. When she spoke, her voice carried that distinctive Acadian accent that had faded from my own speech during my years up north. "You've been staring at that thing for 10 minutes now," she whispered. "What's got you so fixated?" I wanted to tell her about the stains, about the way the barrel seemed to be sweating despite the cool air in the room, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I shrugged and mumbled something about old memories. She followed my gaze upward. "Papa always said that barrel was cursed, said it came from the old Trem plantation, the one that burned down in '73. The creaking came again, louder this time. Several other people looked up, their conversations faltering for a moment before resuming. But I noticed the way their eyes lingered on the ceiling, the way they unconsciously stepped closer to the walls. "When's the last time anyone checked the mounting?" I asked. Marie's laugh was brittle. "You sound like an engineer, always worried about the practical things." But I was worried. The barrel had to weigh at least 1,000 pounds when full, and from the sound of liquid sloshing inside when the house settled, it definitely wasn't empty. The mounting hardware looked original, probably installed decades ago when the house was built. Metal fatigue was a real concern, especially in this humidity. Another creak, followed by a sound like fabric tearing. This time, everyone heard it. The conversations died away gradually, like ripples spreading outward from a stone dropped in still water. All eyes turned upward as a bead of dark liquid formed at the bottom of the barrel and hung there for a long moment before falling to the polished floor with a sound like a teardrop hitting glass. Then another, and another. Within seconds, a steady drip had become a stream, then multiple streams as the liquid found new paths between the swollen staves. The smell hit us then, rich and cloying, with an undertone of something organic and wrong. It wasn't wine. Wine didn't smell like copper and earth and things better left buried. The streams multiplied, converging into rivulets that ran down the sides of the barrel like veins on a diseased heart. The liquid spattered onto the floor in an increasing tempo, creating a percussion section that seemed to harmonize with the beating of my own pulse. People began backing away from the center of the room, their movements careful and deliberate, as if sudden motion might anger whatever force was at work above us. But there was nowhere to go. The parlor had only one entrance, and we were all crowded in like sardines in a can. The dripping intensified, becoming a proper deluge. The liquid struck the floor with such force that it began to splash, sending droplets across the room to spatter against the walls and furniture. Someone's dress shoes squeaked against the wet hardwood as they struggled to maintain their footing. But it was the color that made my breath catch in my throat. In the dim light of the parlor, the liquid looked almost black, but when it caught the glow from the table lamps, it revealed itself to be a deep, arterial red. Not the ruby red of wine, but something darker, more vital. It moved with a thickness that made my stomach clench, pooling in the depressions between the floorboards and spreading outward in patterns that looked disturbingly intentional. Grandmother Celeste continued her prayers, her voice rising above the sound of the falling liquid like a counterpoint to chaos. Her words were in French, the old Creole patois that few people spoke anymore, and though I couldn't understand most of what she was saying, the cadence was hypnotic, almost ritualistic. That's when I saw it. The surface of the spreading pool began to shift, the liquid moving in ways that had nothing to do with gravity or surface tension. Ripples formed without any apparent source, creating concentric circles that intersected and interfered with each other in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the house itself was listing like a ship taking on water. My vision blurred, and I blinked hard, trying to clear my head. The lack of fresh air was getting to me. That had to be it. The room was too crowded, too warm, and the smell of that liquid was making me dizzy. But when my vision cleared, the patterns in the pool had changed. What I saw there made my knees weak. A face was forming in the surface of the liquid. Not reflected, but emerging from within, as if someone was rising from beneath. The features came into focus slowly. High cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a beard that seemed to writhe with a life of its own. But it was the expression that made my blood run cold. It was smiling. Not a pleasant smile, not the benevolent expression of a saint or an angel, but something predatory and knowing. The eyes, if they could be called eyes, seemed to track the movement of people around the room, focusing on each person in turn, with an intensity that was almost physical. I wanted to scream, to point, to make someone else see what I was seeing. But when I looked around the room, everyone else seemed frozen in place, their faces blank and distant, as if they were seeing something entirely different, or seeing nothing at all. Only Grandmother Celeste showed any awareness of what was happening. Her prayers had become more urgent, the words spilling from her lips in a rapid stream that rose and fell like incantation. But she wasn't looking at the pool. She was staring directly at me, her ancient eyes bright with something that might have been recognition or warning. The face in the liquid turned its attention to her, and the smile widened, revealing teeth like broken glass. The old woman's voice faltered for just a moment, but then resumed with renewed intensity. Her fingers worked the rosary beads with increasing speed, each Hail Mary, a small victory against whatever was trying to manifest in the spreading pool. The smell was getting stronger now, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. Iron and earth and something else. Something that reminded me of the time I'd found that dead possum in the crawl space under my apartment, weeks after it had died. My stomach churned, and I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth to keep from gagging. The liquid continued to fall, but its behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Some drops seemed to hang in the air longer than physics would allow, while others struck the floor with impacts that shook the entire house. The pool was spreading faster now, reaching the edges of the room and beginning to seep under the baseboards. I could feel it soaking through the leather of my shoes. That's when the singing started. It wasn't coming from anyone in the room. I could see everyone's mouths, and none of them were moving. Instead, the sound seemed to emanate from the liquid itself, a low harmonic that seemed to resonate in my bones. The melody was beautiful and terrible, like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human. The face in the pool was looking at me again, and this time I was certain it could see me. Its mouth was moving in time with the singing, though no sound emerged from those liquid lips. Around the room, people began to sway slightly, their movements unconscious and rhythmic, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. But not Grandmother Celeste. She was fighting back with everything she had, her prayers becoming a battle cry against the thing in the pool. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air, and her knuckles were white where they gripped the rosary. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I felt my own body beginning to respond to its call. My feet wanted to move, to step forward into that spreading pool, to let the liquid cover my shoes and my ankles and keep going until I was completely submerged. The urge was almost overwhelming, a compulsion that felt like hunger and thirst and longing all rolled into one. I forced myself to take a step backward instead, and the effort was like trying to move through molasses. Something was holding me in place, something that didn't want me to leave. The air around me felt thick and resistant, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. The face in the pool turned its attention away from me for a moment, focusing on someone else, Cousin Harold, who had always been weak-willed and suggestible. Harold's eyes had gone completely blank, and he was taking small, shuffling steps toward the center of the room. That's when Grandmother Celeste's voice changed. The French words became something else entirely, syllables that didn't belong to any language I'd ever heard. They seemed to come from deep in her chest, resonating with a power that made the air shimmer around her wheelchair. The liquid on the floor began to smoke where it had spread nearest to her, producing wisps of vapor that smelled like burning sage. The face in the pool contorted with what might have been rage or pain, its features becoming more distinct and more terrible. I could see every line in its skin, every hair in its beard, every broken blood vessel in its eyes. It was completely real, as solid and present as anyone else in the room. But then something impossible happened. The liquid began to retreat, not evaporating. I could see it moving, flowing backward across the floor like a film running in reverse. The drops that had splashed against the walls ran upward, defying gravity to return to their source. Within moments, the entire deluge was flowing back up into the barrel, leaving the floor completely dry. The face lingered for a few seconds longer, its expression shifting from rage to something that might have been disappointment. Then it too began to fade, the features becoming indistinct before disappearing entirely. The singing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Around the room, people began to blink and look around in confusion, as if waking from a shared dream. Harold stopped his forward movement and stared down at his feet in bewilderment. Someone coughed. Someone else cleared their throat, but they were all acting like nothing had happened. Marie turned to me with a puzzled expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Are you feeling all right?" I looked up at the barrel. It hung there peacefully, its iron hoops solid and secure, its dark wood completely dry. There was no sign that anything unusual had occurred. Even the smell was gone, replaced by the familiar sense of flowers and furniture polish. Only Grandmother Celeste seemed to remember. She was watching me with those ancient eyes, her rosary still clutched in her hands. When our gazes met, she gave me the slightest nod, as if confirming that yes, it had been real, and yes, she had stopped it. But stopped what, exactly? I spent the rest of the wake studying that barrel, looking for any sign of what I'd experienced. The wood was old and stained, certainly, but the patterns I thought I'd seen were just the natural variations in the grain. The mounting hardware looked solid enough to support twice the weight. By the time we left for the cemetery, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been a hallucination brought on by stress and humidity, and the claustrophobic atmosphere of a crowded funeral. Almost. But that night, alone in my childhood bedroom in Aunt Delphine's house, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the old building settling around me. Every creak and groan seemed significant. Every whisper of wind through the eaves sounded like distant singing, and somewhere in the walls, I could swear I heard the sound of liquid dripping. The next morning, I found Grandmother Celeste in her wheelchair on the front porch, staring out at the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks in the yard. When I sat down beside her, she spoke without looking at me. "Some things don't stay buried," she said in her accented English. "Some things find ways to come back." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head and fingered her rosary beads. "You got the sight," she continued, "just like your mama did. That's why it showed itself to you." "What showed itself?" She turned to look at me then, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never noticed before. A deep, abiding weariness, as if she'd been fighting the same battle for decades. "The thing in the barrel," she said simply. "The thing that's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" but she wouldn't say anything more. She just sat there, rocking gently in her wheelchair and watching the morning shadows shift across the yard. I left Louisiana the next day, driving north through Mississippi and Alabama with my windows down and the radio turned up loud, trying to drown out the echo of that otherworldly singing that seemed to follow me down the highway. But I can't shake the feeling that I left something unfinished back there in that house, with its smell of lavender and old wood. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment in Atlanta, I catch myself listening for the sound of dripping. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I think I see patterns forming in spilled coffee or rainwater on the window. Patterns that look almost like a face. A face that's still smiling. I've done some research since then, diving into old property records and newspaper archives. The Delacroix house was built in 1847 on land that had previously been part of a larger plantation. That plantation burned in 1873, just like Marie had said, but the cause was never determined. What I did find was a record of a winemaking operation that had existed on the property before the fire, and a notation about a barrel that had been recovered from the ruins and relocated. A barrel that had been found sealed, despite the intense heat of the blaze. A barrel that contained something other than wine. The records don't say what. I've thought about going back, about confronting whatever it is that's waiting in that dark oak vessel. But Grandmother Celeste died last month, and with her went the only person who knew how to keep the thing contained. Aunt Delphine called to tell me about the funeral, but I couldn't bring myself to make the trip. I told her I was too busy with work. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what I might see if I look up at that barrel again. I'm afraid of what might be looking back. And I'm terrified that next time, there won't be anyone there to make it stop. Story 10. The afternoon sun felt different that day, heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on my skin with deliberate intent. I'd been lounging in the backyard for maybe 20 minutes, letting the warmth seep into my bones after 3 days of rain that had turned everything gray and soggy. The air still held that post-storm dampness, thick and earthy, mixed with the scent of wet grass and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic. I was lying on the old wooden deck chair, eyes half closed, when the movement caught my peripheral vision. Just a flutter at first, like a bird landing, but wrong somehow. Too deliberate, too familiar. When I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. There, crossing the lawn about 30 feet away, was myself. Not someone who looked like me, not a stranger wearing similar clothes. It was me, same height, same build, same faded blue t-shirt with the small tear near the left shoulder that I'd gotten catching it on a fence last month. The figure moved with my exact gait, that slight favor of the right leg from an old basketball injury, the way I unconsciously rolled my shoulders when walking across uneven ground. But it wasn't looking at me. It was looking straight ahead, focused on something I couldn't see, walking with purpose toward the back door of my house. I sat up so fast the deck chair creaked in protest. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the humid air, but the walking figure, the other me, didn't react, didn't even pause, just kept moving across the grass with that familiar rhythmic step. "Hey!" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. My throat felt dry, constricted. I tried again, louder this time. "Hey!" Nothing. The figure reached the back door and I watched, frozen, disbelieving, as it reached out with my own hand, turned the knob with my own motion, and disappeared inside. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the closed door. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. A bead of sweat traced down my spine despite the fact that I was suddenly cold all over. Then I was moving, stumbling off the deck chair and jogging across the lawn. The grass squelched under my bare feet, still waterlogged from the rain. Each step felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream where physics worked differently. The distance to the door seemed to stretch and contract with each stride. I reached for the handle and paused. What if it was locked? What if whoever, whatever, had just entered, had locked it behind them? But the knob turned easily under my palm, just as it always did. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. Coffee mug in the sink, newspaper folded on the counter, that morning's breakfast plate still sitting by the window. Everything normal, everything unchanged, except for the feeling that someone had just been here. The air felt disturbed somehow, like invisible ripples spreading out from where someone had passed through. I stood perfectly still, listening. The house had always been quiet, too quiet sometimes, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that came after sound, the echo of presence rather than absence. Hello? My voice sounded thin and ridiculous in the empty kitchen. Is someone here? No answer. Of course, no answer. I moved through the house room by room, checking closets, looking under beds, examining every corner where someone might hide. It was my own house, but I felt like an intruder, like I was violating some unspoken rule by being there. Each footstep on the hardwood floors seemed to announce my presence to whatever might be listening. In the living room, I stopped. Everything looked normal. Couch where it should be, TV off, books stacked on the coffee table exactly as I'd left them. But something was wrong. Something was different. The smell, that metallic scent I'd noticed outside, was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of old pennies and static electricity. I was turning to leave when I saw it. My t-shirt was hanging on the back of the desk chair, the same blue t-shirt I was wearing. Same faded color, same small tear near the shoulder. It hung there casually, as if someone had just taken it off and draped it over the chair without thinking. The way I might do if I was changing clothes quickly. But I hadn't been in this room today. I'd gone straight from the bedroom to the kitchen to the backyard that morning. I hadn't moved this chair, hadn't hung anything on it. I approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if I moved too fast. The closer I got, the more certain I became. This wasn't just similar to my shirt, it was identical, down to a small coffee stain near the bottom hem that I'd gotten 2 weeks ago and never managed to wash out completely. I reached out to touch it, then stopped. My hand was shaking. If this was my shirt, then what was I wearing? I looked down at myself. Blue t-shirt, faded exactly the same way, with the same tear near the shoulder. I grabbed the fabric between my fingers, felt its reality, its warmth from my body. Definitely real, definitely there. But so was the other one. I forced myself to touch the hanging shirt. The fabric felt wrong under my fingers. Not quite the right temperature, not quite the right texture. It was like touching a photograph of fabric rather than fabric itself. But it was there, solid, real. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the chair. For the next hour, I searched every inch of the house again. I looked for signs of entry, for anything disturbed or out of place. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Everything was normal, except for the shirt. When I came back to the living room, it was still there, hanging motionless in the still air. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe I'd sleepwalked. Maybe I'd hung it there yesterday and forgotten. Maybe the stress from work was making me paranoid, making me see things that weren't there. But I knew my own habits, my own routines. I knew I hadn't touched that chair. As evening approached, the house seemed to grow darker faster than it should have. Shadows lengthened and deepened in corners where I'd never noticed shadows before. The normal sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of clocks, the settling of old wood, seemed louder, more deliberate. I kept finding myself looking over my shoulder, turning at movements that weren't there, listening for footsteps that never came. At dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with my back to the wall, facing the doorway. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the living room where the shirt still hung like a question mark. I'd thought about taking it down, throwing it away, but something kept stopping me. Some instinct that warned against disturbing it. The food tasted like cardboard. I realized I was holding my fork too tightly, my knuckles white with tension. When I finally went to bed, I locked the bedroom door behind me. I'd never locked it before. Who locks bedroom doors in their own house? but the small click of the mechanism made me feel marginally safer. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house around me. Every sound seemed magnified. The whisper of wind against the windows, the distant hum of traffic, the rhythmic tick of the clock on the nightstand. And underneath it all, something else. Something so faint I might have been imagining it. Footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps moving through the house below. The same gait I'd seen crossing the lawn. The same rhythm I used when walking through my own home. I held my breath and listened. The sounds continued for maybe 10 minutes, moving from room to room, pausing occasionally, then continuing. Always slow, always deliberate, always familiar. Then they stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, straining to hear any other sound, any indication that someone was still down there. But the house had returned to its normal quiet. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke to the sound of my own voice. Not loud, barely above a whisper, but definitely my voice, coming from somewhere else in the house. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence and tone that I recognized as unmistakably mine. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. The room was dark except for thin slices of streetlight cutting through the blinds. I lay perfectly still, trying to convince myself I'd been dreaming. Then I heard it again. Definitely my voice. Definitely coming from downstairs. Moving as quietly as possible, I got out of bed and crept to the door. The house felt different at night. Older, more secretive. The familiar layout seemed foreign in the darkness, full of new angles and unexpected depths. I unlocked the bedroom door and eased it open. The hallway stretched away into shadows, but I could see the faint glow from the living room. Had I left a light on? Step by step, I made my way downstairs. The wood creaked under my weight despite my attempts at stealth. Each sound seemed to echo through the house like an announcement. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. The living room was dimly lit by the streetlight outside, casting everything in strange silhouettes. But something was different. The shirt was gone. The chair sat empty, innocent, as if nothing had ever hung there at all. And in its place, lying on the coffee table where it definitely hadn't been before, was a handwritten note. I approached it with the same caution I'd shown the shirt. The handwriting was mine. I recognized the particular slant of my letters, the way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's, but I had no memory of writing it. The message was simple. You're not supposed to be here. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking so badly the paper rustled. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been written minutes ago, but I'd been asleep. I'd been locked in my bedroom. A sound from behind me made me spin around. Nothing there, just the empty hallway and the darkness beyond. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, a weight on my shoulders that made breathing difficult. I could sense eyes on me from every corner, every shadow. The presence that had been hinted at all day was now undeniable. I was not alone in my house. I backed toward the front door, clutching the note in my trembling hand. Each step felt like I was walking through quicksand. The air seemed thicker, harder to move through. Behind me, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I saw what was making that sound, if I confirmed what my mind was already telling me was there, I knew something fundamental would break inside me, some essential understanding of reality that I needed to keep functioning. Instead, I reached for the front door handle and found it locked. The deadbolt that I never used was engaged, the chain latch secured, but I hadn't locked them. I never locked them from the inside. My breath was coming in short gasps now. The metallic smell was stronger than ever, filling my nostrils with its sharp electric tang. Behind me, I heard footsteps again. Slow, measured, approaching. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers clumsy with panic. The deadbolt clicked open. The chain rattled as I slid it free. Finally, the door opened, and cool night air rushed in like salvation. I stumbled outside, not stopping until I reached the street. Only then did I turn around. The house looked exactly as it always did. Quiet suburban home, modest and unremarkable. Porch light off, windows dark. Nothing threatening or supernatural about it, but in the living room window, barely visible, I could see a silhouette. A figure standing motionless, watching me. A figure that looked exactly like me. I stood there on the empty street for a long time, staring at my own house, trying to decide what was real. The note was still crumpled in my hand, physical evidence that something had happened. But already the events of the night were taking on the hazy quality of a half-remembered dream. Maybe I was sick. Maybe stress was finally taking its toll in ways I hadn't expected. Maybe the logical explanation was simply that my mind was fracturing, creating elaborate scenarios to explain away what was probably nothing more than fatigue and paranoia. But when I looked back at the window, the figure was still there, and it was still watching me. As dawn approached, I found myself sitting in my car in a 24-hour diner parking lot, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and trying to make sense of what had happened. The note lay on the table between my hands, proof of something I couldn't explain. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Memory gaps, stress-induced hallucinations, some kind of neurological episode that made me forget my own actions. People could do all sorts of things without remembering. Sleepwalking, automatic behavior, fugue states. But the other part of my mind, the part that had felt the presence in the house, knew better. I never went back to the house that night, or the next day, or the day after that. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in my hotel bed, I can still smell that metallic scent. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I catch a glimpse of someone who looks exactly like me, watching from the shadows. And I know, with absolute certainty, that whatever I saw crossing my lawn that afternoon was never meant to be seen. The question that haunts me now isn't whether it was real. The question is, which one of us is the reflection? Story 11. The first thing you notice about Saltwind Cove isn't the weathered houses perched on stilts above the rocky shore, or the fishing boats bobbing like corks in the harbor. It's the silence that settles over everything at exactly 5 o'clock each evening, as if the entire village holds its breath. I arrived on a Tuesday in late September, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from running away from something you can't name. The cottage I'd rented sight unseen sat at the village's eastern edge, where the main road dissolved into sandy paths and salt grass. Mrs. Henley, the landlady, met me at the door with keys, and a warning delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to mention a leaky faucet. "Windows shut tight by 5, she said, her weathered hands adjusting the lace curtains. "Every evening, without fail. Been that way since before my grandmother's time." I nodded absently, more interested in the cottage's isolation than its superstitions. The place was perfect for what I needed: 4 walls, a roof, and distance from the mess I'd left behind in the city. 3 months of investigation, 3 months of following leads that went nowhere, 3 months of watching my reputation crumble as the department's internal affairs division picked apart every case I'd worked in the past 5 years. I needed space to think, to figure out how Detective Marcus Reed had become a liability to the very system he'd served for 15 years. The cottage's main room faced the ocean through a wall of windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it in dancing patterns across the hardwood floors. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel decorated with shells and sea glass arranged by some previous tenant. The bedroom upstairs offered a view of the village below and the harbor beyond, where fishing boats prepared for the next day's work. That first evening, I unpacked methodically, a habit ingrained by years of processing crime scenes. Everything in its place, everything accounted for. As I worked, I became aware of a peculiar rhythm to the village below. Around 4:30, lights began appearing in windows. By 4:45, the few people still visible on the streets moved with increasing urgency toward their homes. At 5 o'clock precisely, the last door closed, and Saltwind Cove transformed into something resembling a ghost town. Mrs. Henley's warning echoed in my mind as I stood before the ocean-facing windows, watching waves crash against the rocks below. The practical part of my mind, the detective's mind, cataloged possible explanations. Tidal patterns, maybe, or some kind of wildlife migration that made the shoreline dangerous after dark. But as the minutes ticked past 5 and the village remained silent, I felt the first whisper of something else, something that had nothing to do with practical explanations. The sensation started as a tickle between my shoulder blades, the kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you from across a crowded room. I turned from the windows, scanning the empty cottage, but found nothing except shadows lengthening across the floor. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the light outside faded from gold to amber to the deep blue of approaching night. I made dinner from the canned goods I'd brought, eating by the light of a single lamp while the windows grew dark as mirrors. The silence outside was complete. No cars, no voices, not even the usual sounds of a coastal evening. Just the constant whisper of waves against stone and the occasional creak of the cottage settling around me. Wednesday followed the same pattern. I spent the day exploring the village, noting how conversations died when I approached, how eyes followed me with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been pity. The local market, a weathered building that seemed to stock everything from fishing line to fresh bread, fell quiet when I entered. The proprietor, a man whose sun-damaged skin spoke of decades on the water, acknowledged my presence with a nod that somehow conveyed both welcome and warning. "You're staying at the Henley place," he said, not quite a question. I confirmed this, buying coffee and supplies while other customers completed their transactions in hushed tones. As I prepared to leave, the man's voice stopped me. 5 o'clock, he said, his eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder. Windows and doors, every evening. That afternoon, I made a point of being outside as the hour approached, positioning myself on the cottage's small porch where I could observe the village's evening ritual. At 4:30, the transformation began. Figures that had been moving normally through the streets suddenly developed purpose, their pace quickening as they disappeared into houses and shops. By 4:50, the only movement came from curtains being drawn and shutters being latched. At exactly 5 o'clock, the last visible person, an elderly man who'd been working in a garden 3 houses down, straightened as if responding to some unheard signal. He gathered his tools with swift, practiced movements and vanished through his front door. The click of his lock carried clearly in the still air. I remained on the porch, detective's instincts prickling with curiosity. Whatever had these people spooked happened after 5, and I intended to discover what it was. The rational part of my mind suggested atmospheric pressure changes, or perhaps dangerous tides that made the shoreline treacherous after dark. But as I sat there, watching and waiting, rationality began to feel increasingly inadequate. The first thing I noticed was the quality of the silence. It wasn't simply the absence of human activity. It was something deeper, as if the very air had grown thicker, more resistant to sound. Even the waves seemed muffled, their eternal rhythm somehow subdued. The temperature dropped noticeably, not the gradual cooling of evening, but a sudden shift that raised goosebumps along my arms. At 5:07, I heard it. Music, if it could be called that. A melody that seemed to emerge from the direction of the harbor, carried on a breeze that tasted of salt and something else. Something organic and ancient that made the back of my throat close. The tune was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, constructed of notes that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate somewhere deeper, in the space between my ribs where my heartbeat had begun to slow. I tried to stand, to move back toward the cottage door, but my muscles had turned to stone. Not the paralysis of fear, exactly, but something more fundamental, as if my body no longer belonged to me. The melody grew stronger, more complex, and with it came voices. Not words exactly, but sounds that might have been words in some language never meant for human throats. My vision began to tunnel, the edges of the world fading to black, while the cottage windows grew impossibly bright. Through their golden glow, I could see my own reflection, but it was wrong somehow, distorted in ways that had nothing to do with the angle of the glass. The face looking back at me was mine, but somehow older, more weathered, with eyes that held knowledge I didn't remember acquiring. The medallion saved me. I'd forgotten about it entirely until my fingers, moving without conscious direction, found it in my jacket pocket. A simple disc of iron, black with age and worn smooth by countless hands. The fisherman had given it to me that afternoon, pressing it into my palm with words I'd barely registered at the time. "Iron remembers," he'd said, his voice rough as sea-worn rope. "When song takes hold, iron remembers what you forget." The moment my skin made contact with the metal, the world snapped back into focus. The melody cut off as if someone had lifted a needle from a record, and sensation flooded back into my limbs with a rush that left me gasping. I stumbled through the cottage door, slamming it behind me, and spent the next hour sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the wall, clutching the medallion until its edges cut into my palm. The following day brought no answers, only more questions. The fisherman who'd given me the medallion was nowhere to be found, and inquiries about him met with blank stares and shrugged shoulders. According to the market proprietor, no one matching his description lived in Saltwind Cove, and no fisherman had been working the docks when I claimed to have met him. But the medallion was real, solid, and heavy in my pocket. And that evening, as 5 o'clock approached, I found myself once again drawn to test the boundaries of whatever force held the village in its grip. This time I positioned myself inside the cottage but left the ocean-facing windows open, deliberately defying the warnings I'd received. The medallion lay on the kitchen table, close enough to reach but not touching my skin. I wanted to understand what was happening, to approach it with the methodical investigation techniques that had served me well as a detective. The music began at 5:08, just as it had the night before, but this time I was ready for it. I observed the way it seemed to originate not from any specific direction, but from the air itself, as if the molecules around me had suddenly learned to sing. I noted how my body's responses followed a predictable pattern. First the slowing of my pulse, then the gradual loss of motor control, finally, the strange distortion of my visual perception. But I also noticed something else, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. As the paralysis took hold and my vision began to tunnel, I caught sight of movement outside the windows. Figures, walking along the shoreline with the slow, purposeful gait of sleepwalkers. They moved in single file, perhaps 24 of them, heading toward the harbor where the fishing boats bobbed at their moorings. I recognized some of them. Mrs. Henley was there, still wearing the floral dress she'd had on when I'd seen her that afternoon. The market proprietor walked behind her, his usual scowl replaced by an expression of serene vacancy. Others I'd glimpsed around the village formed the remainder of the procession, all moving with the same dreamy, synchronized steps. As they reached the water's edge, the figures began to wade into the surf, their clothes darkening as the waves lapped around their knees, their waists, their chests. The melody grew stronger, more insistent, and I felt my own body begin to respond, my feet moving of their own accord toward the open windows. I fought against the compulsion, but it was like trying to swim upstream in a raging current. Each note of the strange music stripped away another layer of my will, another piece of my resistance. My hand reached for the window latch, and I knew that in moments I would follow the others into the dark water, becoming another sleepwalker in their midnight procession. The medallion lay 3 feet away, but it might as well have been 3 miles. My muscles refused to respond to conscious command, moving only to the rhythm of that alien melody. I could feel consciousness slipping away, replaced by something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. Then, somehow, my fingertips brushed the iron disc. The music shattered like glass, and the world exploded back into normal time and space. Outside the windows, the procession had vanished, leaving only empty beach and rolling waves. I slammed the windows shut and drew the curtains, but not before glimpsing something that made my hands shake as I turned the locks. Wet footprints on the porch outside, leading up to the very windows I'd left open. Footprints that were still steaming in the cool night air. The next morning brought Detective Harris from the county sheriff's office, responding to what he called reports of unusual activity around my cottage. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes, and the kind of careful politeness that law enforcement officers use when they're not sure if they're dealing with a witness or a suspect. "Mr. Reed," he said, settling into the cottage's single armchair while I made coffee. "I understand you're former NYPD." I confirmed this, curious about what had brought him to my door. Harris accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, then leaned back in his chair with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation. "We've had some interesting reports from your neighbors," he said. "Concerns about someone wandering around after dark, disturbing the peace. Now, I know that might not sound like much to a city detective, but things work differently out here. We take community harmony seriously." I studied his face, looking for the tells that had served me well during 15 years of interrogations. Harris seemed genuinely concerned, but also puzzled, as if he wasn't entirely sure why he was here. "I've been staying inside after 5, I said, "just like everyone else." "That's good to hear." Harris sipped his coffee, his eyes moving around the cottage's main room. "Mind if I ask what brings you to Saltwind Cove? We don't get many visitors this time of year." I gave him the abbreviated version: stress leave, need for quiet, temporary retreat from city life. It was true enough, though it left out the internal affairs investigation and the growing certainty that my career in law enforcement was over. Harris listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing half-truths, but he didn't push for details. "Well," he said finally, rising from his chair, "I'm sure whatever misunderstanding led to these reports will work itself out. Just remember that we're a close-knit community here. People look out for each other, and they notice when something doesn't fit the pattern." After he left, I spent the afternoon walking the village, paying attention to the subtle currents of conversation and behavior that swirled around me. The picture that emerged was troubling. According to the fragments I managed to piece together, someone had been seen moving around the village after dark for the past 3 nights. Someone who matched my general description but whose behavior was wrong, somehow. Too purposeful, too knowing, as if they belonged to the night in ways that violated the natural order. The problem was, I had no memory of leaving the cottage after sunset. My last clear recollection each night was of barricading myself inside, medallion clutched in my hand, listening to the silence that followed the strange music. But the reports were specific enough to be troubling. Mentions of a figure walking the shoreline, testing doors and windows, moving with the mechanical precision of a machine. That evening, I prepared more carefully. I set up a simple alarm system using kitchen pots and string, positioned to alert me if any of the cottage's doors or windows were opened from inside. I placed the medallion within easy reach and settled in to wait for 5 o'clock, determined to maintain conscious observation throughout whatever was about to happen. The music began on schedule, rising from the salt-tinged air like some ancient song of the sea. But this time, I was ready for it. I gripped the medallion from the first note, letting its iron reality anchor me against the pull of that otherworldly melody. The paralysis couldn't take hold while I maintained contact with the metal, and I was able to observe the evening's events with something approaching scientific detachment. What I saw defied every rational explanation I could construct. The procession emerged from the village just as it had the night before, but now I could see it clearly. The figures moved with the synchronized precision of a dance, their faces blank with the kind of peaceful expression usually associated with deep sleep. They walked into the surf without hesitation, the water accepting them as if they belonged there, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. But as I watched, something else became clear. One of the figures was wearing my jacket. Not a similar jacket, but the specific leather coat I'd thrown over a chair in the bedroom upstairs. I could see the small tear in the left sleeve where I'd caught it on a fence 2 months ago, the slight discoloration on the collar from years of wear. The figure wearing it moved with my gait, held its shoulders with my particular slouch, even turned its head with the deliberate movement I'd developed after taking a beating from a suspect who got too close during an arrest. It was me, walking among the sleepwalkers, participating in their midnight ritual while my conscious mind watched from the cottage windows. The medallion grew hot in my hand, not with heat but with something else, a vibration that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Through the windows, I could see my doppelganger pause at the water's edge, its head turning toward the cottage as if responding to some unheard signal. For a moment that lasted forever, I found myself staring into my own eyes across 50 yards of beach and surf. Then the figure smiled, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was looking back at me was not human, had never been human, despite wearing my face with perfect accuracy. The music stopped, and the procession dissolved like smoke, but my double remained, standing motionless in the shallow water, still smiling that terrible, knowing smile. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a salute, then turned and walked deeper into the sea until the waves closed over its head. I woke the next morning slumped over the kitchen table, the medallion still gripping in my hand, and my jacket hanging exactly where I'd left it upstairs. The alarm system I'd constructed lay undisturbed, no pots overturned, no strings broken. According to every piece of evidence I could examine, I had not left the cottage during the night. But when I checked the porch outside the ocean-facing windows, I found my footprints in the sand. Fresh footprints, still damp with seawater, leading from the cottage to the beach and back again. Detective Harris returned that afternoon, his demeanor noticeably cooler than during his previous visit. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman in a county medical examiner's jacket accompanied him, along with a younger officer whose hand rested casually on his sidearm. "Mr. Reed," Harris said, declining my offer of coffee, "I'm afraid we need to have a more serious conversation." They'd received additional reports, he explained. More detailed accounts of nighttime disturbances, this time including descriptions that left no doubt about the identity of the person involved. Multiple witnesses had observed someone matching my exact description engaged in behavior that Harris described as concerning and potentially dangerous. "The thing is," Harris continued, studying my face with the intensity of a professional interrogator, "the witnesses are adamant about the timing. These incidents are occurring well after 5 o'clock, when everyone in Saltwind Cove is safely inside their homes. Which raises some interesting questions about what you're doing during those hours." I told him the truth, that I had no memory of leaving the cottage after dark, that I'd been following the village's evening protocol religiously, that something was happening in Saltwind Cove that defied conventional explanation. As I spoke, I watched the subtle interplay of expressions cross his face: skepticism, concern, and something else that might have been recognition. "Mr. Reed," he said finally, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me a direct answer. Do you believe you're experiencing some form of psychological episode? Something that might explain these memory gaps?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I thought about the investigation that had brought me here, about the months of stress and scrutiny that had preceded my arrival in Saltwind Cove. I thought about the medications I'd stopped taking, the sleep I'd been missing, the growing sense that reality had become somehow unreliable. But I also thought about the medallion, solid and heavy in my pocket, about the music that came from nowhere and everywhere, about the procession of sleepwalkers who moved through the village like actors in some ancient, terrible play. "Detective Harris," I said, "have you ever experienced the evening ritual yourself? The windows and doors, the silence after 5 o'clock? His expression shifted, becoming guarded in a way that told me more than any verbal response could have. "Mr. Reed, I think it would be best if you considered returning to the city. Get the help you need. Talk to a professional about what you're experiencing." That night, I made a decision that probably saved my sanity, if not my life. Instead of waiting for 5 o'clock, I packed my belongings and prepared to leave Saltwind Cove immediately. Whatever was happening here, whatever force could reach into my mind and puppet my body while my consciousness watched helplessly, I wanted no part of it. But as I carried my duffel bag toward the rental car parked outside the cottage, I realized I'd made a critical error. In my haste to escape, I'd left the medallion on the kitchen table. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose. According to my watch, it was 4:58 in the evening. The village around me was already falling into its familiar pattern of silence and withdrawal, lights disappearing from windows as the residents of Saltwind Cove prepared for another night of whatever passed for normal in this place. I had perhaps 90 seconds to retrieve the medallion and get out before 5 o'clock brought the music and everything that came with it. 90 seconds to cover 30 yards, grab a piece of iron, and escape the trap that Saltwind Cove had become. I almost made it. The cottage door was still open. My bag dropped on the threshold as I sprinted toward the kitchen table where the medallion waited. My fingers closed around it just as the first notes of that impossible music began to rise from the evening air. But this time was different. This time, the melody seemed to be waiting for me, personally crafted to slip through whatever defenses the iron medallion provided. The paralysis struck with the force of a physical blow, dropping me to my knees in the cottage's main room while my muscles locked into place. Through the windows, I could see the procession forming earlier than usual, the sleepwalkers emerging from their homes with the purposeful movement of people responding to a long-awaited summons. But something had changed in their formation, something that filled me with a terror deeper than anything I'd experienced during my years as a detective. They were all looking at the cottage, all of them, moving in perfect synchronization, their faces turned toward the windows where I knelt, paralyzed and helpless, and as I watched, they began to walk not toward the harbor but toward my temporary sanctuary, their movements slow and deliberate and absolutely unstoppable. Mrs. Henley reached the porch first, her familiar face transformed by the same serene vacancy that marked all the sleepwalkers. Behind her came the market proprietor, Detective Harris, the medical examiner who'd accompanied him that afternoon, and dozens of others I'd glimpsed during my brief time in the village. They arranged themselves in a semicircle around the cottage, standing motionless in the growing darkness. Then one of them spoke, and I understood that everything I'd witnessed over the past week had been leading to this moment. "Marcus Reed," the voice said, though I couldn't tell which of the figures had produced it. The words seemed to come from all of them simultaneously, a chorus that made the cottage windows vibrate in their frames. "You have seen what others cannot see. You have heard what others cannot hear. You have touched iron and remembered what others choose to forget." The medallion was burning in my hand now, not with heat but with some essential coldness that seemed to flow directly into my bloodstream. Through its influence, I could feel my muscles beginning to respond again, sensation returning to my extremities like pins and needles magnified beyond endurance. "For 15 years, the chorus continued, you have sought truth in a world built on comfortable lies. You have seen the darkness that lives behind human faces, the rot that festers beneath civilization's skin. But here, in Saltwind Cove, you have found something else, something older, something that remembers what humanity was before it learned to fear the dark." I managed to raise my head, to look directly at the assembled figures through the cottage windows. Their faces were peaceful, beatific even, but their eyes held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical limitations of human anatomy. "The iron remembers," they said, and now I could see that several of them wore medallions identical to mine, dark discs hanging from chains around their necks. "It remembers the bargain made long ago, when the first settlers came to this place. Protection in exchange for participation, safety in exchange for surrender. One night each month, when the tide is highest and the moon is dark, we become what we were always meant to be." Understanding hit me like a physical blow. The monthly cycle, the carefully maintained ritual, the way the village functioned with clockwork precision during the day, while transforming into something else entirely after sunset. Saltwind Cove wasn't haunted. It was symbiotic, existing in perfect balance with forces that predated human civilization by eons. "But you," the chorus said, and now I could hear individual voices within the collective, could pick out Mrs. Henley's weathered tones and Detective Harris's professional cadence and others I'd encountered during my stay. "You resist the song. You cling to iron and fight against the pull of deeper currents. You stand outside the cycle, observing without participating, taking without giving." The figures began to move closer, their feet making no sound on the cottage's wooden porch. Through the glass, I could see their eyes reflecting the light from inside, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance with each movement. "Choose," they said, and the word resonated through the cottage, like a bell tolling in some vast cathedral. "Join the song willingly, and become part of something greater than the sum of its parts, or continue to resist." and discover what happens to those who break the harmony that keeps this place in balance. The medallion was growing heavier in my hand, its weight seeming to increase with each passing second. I could feel it pulling downward, as if gravity itself had become focused on this single point of contact between my flesh and the ancient iron, and with that weight came knowledge. Not thoughts exactly, but understanding that flowed directly into my consciousness without the mediation of language or logic. I saw Saltwind Cove as it had been centuries ago, when the first European settlers arrived to find a landscape already occupied by something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. I witnessed the negotiations that followed, the careful diplomatic dance between human ambition and alien intelligence that resulted in the bargain that still governed this place. Protection for the village, prosperity for its fishing fleet, peace for all who lived within the boundaries they established, in exchange for one night each month when the residents would set aside their humanity and become part of something larger. But I also saw what happened to those who violated the agreement. The tourists who ignored warnings and wandered outside after 5 o'clock, only to be found days later, walking the bottom of the harbor with expressions of perfect contentment on their faces. The investigators who came asking too many questions and left with their memories carefully edited, their reports filled with explanations that satisfied their superiors while revealing nothing of importance. The occasional resident who lost faith in the bargain and tried to expose the truth, only to discover that some truths were too large and too alien for human institutions to process. "The choice is before you," the chorus said, and now I could see that the figures outside had been joined by others, shapes that moved differently, with the fluid grace of things that had never needed to pretend to be human. Become part of the song or become part of the silence that follows. I looked down at the medallion in my hand, feeling its weight like an anchor dragging me toward depths I couldn't fathom. The iron was old, older than the village, older perhaps than human presence on this continent. It remembered things that predated memory, witnessed events that had never been recorded in any history book, and through my contact with it, I was being offered a choice that no human being should ever have to make. But as I knelt there in the cottage's golden light, surrounded by forces that rendered my 15 years of police experience utterly meaningless, I realized something that changed everything. The medallion wasn't just protection against the song. It was also a membership card, a token of participation in something far older and more complex than I'd understood. The fisherman who'd given it to me hadn't been saving me from the village's dark secret. He'd been inviting me to join it. I closed my eyes and let the medallion fall from my fingers. The music that filled the cottage then was unlike anything I'd experienced during my previous encounters with the song. Where before it had been alien and threatening, now it was welcoming, embracing, full of harmonies that seemed to resonate with frequencies I'd carried in my bones without knowing they existed. My body rose of its own accord, muscles moving with fluid precision toward the cottage door. Outside, the assembled figures parted to create a path leading toward the harbor. As I walked among them, I could see their faces clearly for the first time, and what I found there wasn't the vacant emptiness I'd expected, but something else entirely. Peace, perhaps, or acceptance. The kind of contentment that comes from finally understanding your place in a pattern too vast for individual comprehension. Mrs. Henley smiled at me as I passed, her expression warm with genuine affection. Detective Harris nodded approvingly, as if I'd just passed some crucial test. Others I didn't recognize offered gestures of welcome, hands extended in greeting or raised in salute. Behind them, moving with the same purposeful grace, came the shapes that weren't quite human, beings whose forms shifted and flowed like living water given temporary substance. We walked together toward the harbor, where the fishing boats waited with their nets and lines and hooks. But tonight, they would be fishing for something other than the ordinary denizens of the deep. Tonight, they would cast their nets into currents that flowed between worlds, harvesting knowledge and experience and memory from depths that existed in dimensions perpendicular to ordinary space. As we reached the water's edge, I felt the last vestiges of my individual consciousness beginning to dissolve into something larger, more complete. The detective who had arrived in Saltwind Cove a week ago was fading away. replaced by something that understood its role in the cosmic dance that kept this place in balance with forces older than civilization. But just before the transformation became complete, just before Marcus Reed disappeared entirely into the collective consciousness that governed this place, I caught sight of something that sent a shock of recognition through my dissolving sense of self. There, walking among the other figures with the same peaceful expression and fluid movement, was another man wearing my face. The same height, the same build, the same distinctive scar along his jawline from a knife fight in an alley behind a Queen's bodega 15 years ago. He turned toward me as our paths converged, and for a moment that lasted forever, I found myself staring into my own eyes. Then he smiled, that same terrible, knowing smile I'd witnessed from the cottage windows, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was not the first Marcus Reed to arrive in Saltwind Cove seeking solitude and healing. Perhaps not even the second or the third. The song grew stronger, more insistent, and my individual thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. But in those final moments of separate consciousness, I managed to hold on to one last crucial realization. Somewhere in New York City, in an apartment I'd never see again, another Marcus Reed was probably packing his bags for a much-needed vacation. A man with my memories, my scars, my badge number and service record, ready to drive north to a quiet coastal village where he could rest and recover from the pressures of police work. He would arrive carrying nothing but a duffel bag and bone-deep exhaustion. Mrs. Henley would meet him at the cottage door with keys and a warning about keeping windows closed after 5 o'clock. And in a week's time, when the moon was dark and the tide was highest, he would face the same choice I was facing now. The water was warm around my ankles, then my knees, then my chest. Above us, stars wheeled in patterns that had nothing to do with the familiar constellations I'd learned as a child. The song filled everything, the air, the water, the space between my atoms, and I let it carry me deeper, toward depths where individual identity became meaningless, and the only truth was harmony. But somewhere in the back of my dissolving mind, I wondered if the next Marcus Reed would be smarter than I'd been, if he would recognize the trap before it closed, resist the song long enough to escape, find a way to break the cycle that kept feeding fresh versions of the same story into this place. Or if he would make the same choice I was making, walking willingly into waters that would transform him into something both more and less than human. The last thing I remember thinking, before thought itself became irrelevant, was that the iron medallion was still lying on the cottage floor, waiting for whoever came next, ready to offer protection or invitation, depending on how you chose to interpret its purpose. Either way, the song would continue, the pattern would persist, and Saltwind Cove would remain exactly what it had always been, a place where reality bent around older truths, where the bargains made in humanity's youth continued to shape the present in ways that most people would never understand. The water closed over my head, and I became part of something vast and patient, and utterly beyond human comprehension. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of a car engine, growing closer as another traveler found his way to this place of transformation and revelation. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. And in my pocket, identical to the one I'd left behind, another iron medallion waited to play its part in the eternal dance between protection and participation, between safety and surrender, between the human need for answers and the terrible cost of finding them. Story 12. The badge sits on my nightstand like a talisman against the dark. Its metallic surface catches the amber glow from the street lamp outside, throwing fractured light across the ceiling in patterns that shift with every passing car. Mission badge, 47 Delta. It reads in block letters beneath the agency seal, a simple piece of government-issued aluminum that has become the only barrier between my sanity and the thing that wants my voice. I know how it sounds. 3 months ago, I would have recommended psychiatric evaluation for anyone telling me this story. But 3 months ago, I hadn't returned from the Kowalski operation, hadn't seen what we found in that basement laboratory, Hadn't spent 17 days in debriefing rooms where men in suits asked the same questions over and over until the words lost all meaning. The first night without the badge happened by accident. I'd come home exhausted, my shirt soaked through with the kind of sweat that comes from fluorescent interrogation rooms, and too much coffee. I stripped down in the darkness, tossed everything into the hamper, and collapsed into bed without my usual ritual of placing the badge where I could see it, where it could see me. That's when I met him. The dream began like drowning in reverse. Instead of water filling my lungs, something was being drawn out of them, pulled through my throat in long, silver threads that tasted of copper and fear. I tried to scream but produced only whispers, then silence. In the corner of my bedroom, not the dream bedroom, but my actual room, a figure stood watching. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, a grin that seemed to unhinge at the corners and extend beyond the boundaries of its face. I woke choking, my vocal cords raw as if I'd been screaming for hours. But when I tried to call out, nothing came. The silence in my throat felt hollow, excavated. Only when I grabbed the badge from the floor, where it had fallen from my discarded shirt, did my voice return, first as a croak, then a sob, finally a whispered prayer to whatever deity might protect government operatives from the things they encounter in the dark. Since then, the badge hasn't left my nightstand. Every evening, I place it exactly 3 inches from the lamp base, angled so its surface reflects the window. Every morning, I check to ensure it hasn't moved. It never has, but the ritual matters. Precision keeps the dreams at bay. Well, mostly. With the badge in place, he still comes. But he keeps his distance now, relegated to the corner where shadows pool deepest. He doesn't try to steal my voice anymore. He simply watches with those black holes where eyes should be. That smile never wavering, never quite fitting the architecture of his face. Sometimes I catch peripheral movement and turn to find nothing but the interplay of streetlight and curtain. Other times, I wake to the distinct sensation of being observed and lie still until dawn, afraid to look directly at the corner but hyper-aware of the patient presence waiting there. Dr. Meridian, the agency psychologist, suggested the dreams were manifestations of post-traumatic stress. Guilt over classified operations, she explained, often crystallized into symbolic figures representing moral compromise. The badge, she theorized, served as a psychological anchor, a reminder of purpose and authority that my subconscious used to maintain control over traumatic memories. Her explanation was clinical, logical, thoroughly documented in my file. It was also wrong. The Kowalski operation had been routine surveillance until it wasn't. 3 weeks of watching a suspected arms dealer led us to a basement laboratory where we found equipment that shouldn't exist. Machines that hummed with frequencies that made your teeth ache and your vision blur at the edges. The technical team spent hours photographing everything before the site was sanitized, their cameras capturing devices that seemed to bend light around themselves, instruments that registered on no known spectrum, but somehow felt hungry when you looked at them too long. In the center of it all sat a chair fitted with electrodes and restraints, its leather worn smooth by struggling bodies. Next to it, a journal filled with sketches of human figures being drained of something essential, something that looked remarkably like the silver threads I'd seen being pulled from my throat in that first dream. We never found Kowalski. The basement was empty except for the equipment and 17 video files we couldn't bring ourselves to finish watching. In the fragments we did see, subjects sat in that chair while something was extracted from them. Not blood, not organs, but something that left them hollowed out, their eyes empty, their voices gone. The debriefing lasted longer than the operation itself. Men in expensive suits asked about every detail, cross-referenced our reports with satellite imagery and electromagnetic readings that painted impossible pictures. They wanted to know about exposure times, proximity to the equipment, any unusual sensations or dreams following the mission. I told them about the humming, the way the machine seemed to watch us work. I didn't mention the feeling that something had followed us home. That would have been the end of it. File closed, operation classified, team reassigned, except for Thompson. 2 weeks after debriefing ended, he called me at 3 in the morning, his voice barely a whisper through the phone static. He'd been having dreams, he said. Dreams about losing his voice, about being watched. Dreams about a thing with a smile too wide for its face. Thompson had thrown away his mission badge the day after we returned, sick of carrying reminders of a job that had gone sideways. When the dreams started, he'd tried everything: sleep medication, meditation, even self-hypnosis. Nothing worked. The thing in his dreams grew bolder each night, its smile wider, its hunger more evident. By the time he called me, he hadn't slept more than 2 hours consecutively in a week. I told him about the badge, about the corner watching, about the difference between protected and unprotected sleep. He laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and hung up. 3 days later, he showed up at my apartment carrying a replacement badge requested through official channels. The bags under his eyes had deepened to bruises, but his voice was steady, relieved. "It works," he said simply. "The son of a bitch is still there, but he keeps his distance now." We started meeting weekly after that, unofficial check-ins disguised as casual drinks. Neither of us spoke directly about our situation. Agency training runs deep, but we developed a shorthand for our shared experience. Thompson would ask if I'd been getting good sleep lately, and I'd respond that my bedroom arrangement was working out fine. Code 4, the badges were holding, the watchers were keeping their distance. We were maintaining some semblance of normal life. The arrangement worked for 2 months. Then Thompson missed our Tuesday meeting. I called his cell, disconnected. His apartment, no answer. The agency claimed he'd requested extended leave for family reasons. But Thompson had no family. His parents died in a car accident when he was 22, no siblings, never married. When I pressed for details, I was reminded that discussing classified personnel matters violated 6 federal regulations. Thompson had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that our shared nightmares were connected to something larger than post-traumatic stress. That night, I checked my badge placement 3 times before bed. The street lamp outside flickered intermittently, casting unsteady shadows across my bedroom walls. In the corner, the familiar presence settled into its usual position, patient, watching, waiting for any sign of weakness in my defenses. But something was different. The smile seemed wider tonight, more confident. And for the first time since that initial encounter, I thought I detected movement beyond simple observation. The slightest lean forward, as if testing boundaries that had suddenly become less certain. I lay awake until dawn, maintaining eye contact with the shadow in the corner, both of us aware that the balance of power was shifting. Whatever had taken Thompson was growing stronger, and the badge that had protected me for months was beginning to feel less like a shield and more like a temporary postponement. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Dr. Meridian's secretary called to reschedule my quarterly psychological evaluation. Apparently, the doctor had suffered a vocal cord injury and would be unable to speak for several weeks. The nature of the injury, she explained, was quite unusual. The cords appeared to have been damaged from the inside out, as if something had been forcibly extracted from her throat. I set the phone down with shaking hands and stared at the badge on my nightstand. Its surface reflected my face back at me, but the reflection seemed subtly wrong. The smile too wide, the eyes too dark. That evening, I placed the badge in its usual position and prepared for bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every shadow seemed to pulse with potential movement. Every creak of the building suggested approaching footsteps. The corner where my watcher usually stationed himself remained empty, which somehow felt more threatening than his presence. Around 3 a.m., I finally understood why. He wasn't in the corner anymore. He was standing directly beside my bed, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from his form, close enough to see that his smile had grown to encompass his entire face. No longer a mouth, but a gaping void edged with what might have been teeth, or might have been stars seen from very far away. The badge sat exactly where I'd placed it, unchanged and apparently ineffective. Either its power had been drained, or the rules of our engagement had fundamentally altered. When he reached toward my throat with fingers like smoke, I tried to scream, but produced only silence. Not because my voice was being stolen, but because it was already gone. I woke the next morning with my voice intact, the badge still on my nightstand, the corner empty of observers. But the dream felt different this time, less like a nightmare and more like a memory of something that had actually happened. And when I looked in the bathroom mirror, my reflection smiled back at me with a grin just slightly too wide for my face. The badge still sits on my nightstand every night. I still place it in exactly the same position, still angle it to catch the streetlight's glow. But I'm no longer certain whether it's protecting me from the thing in the corner or protecting the thing in the corner from what I'm becoming. Sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, I wonder if Thompson and Dr. Meridian discovered the same truth I'm beginning to understand, that the badges don't repel the watchers. They mark us. They identify those who've seen too much, been exposed to frequencies that human minds weren't designed to process, encountered equipment that operates on principles beyond our understanding. The thing in the corner isn't trying to steal my voice anymore. It's waiting for me to surrender it willingly, to accept that the person who went into that basement laboratory isn't the same one who came out. The badge serves as a reminder of who I used to be, but reflections don't lie, and my smile grows a little wider each night. I've started leaving the bedroom light on, not because darkness brings fear, but because I'm beginning to enjoy watching the neighbors sleep through their windows. Their voices look so bright in the darkness, so easy to reach, so simple to extract. The badge still keeps the nightmares away, but I'm starting to realize that I was never the one being protected. I was the nightmare, and everyone else needed protection from me. Tomorrow I think I'll leave the badge in its drawer. After all, why should I hide from what I've become? The corner of my bedroom remains empty now, but that's fine. I found a much better place to watch from. Story 13. The metal detector beeped frantically as I swept it across the concrete floor of cell block D, but I knew it wasn't picking up any coins or jewelry. 3 months into this restoration project, and the damn thing had developed its own personality, shrieking at shadows, going silent in places where we'd already found rusted shackles embedded in the walls. The Millbrook Correctional Facility had been abandoned since 1987, but sometimes it felt like the building was still very much alive. I switched off the detector and wiped sweat from my forehead, despite the October chill that seemed to seep through the limestone walls. The smell hit me again, that sharp, acrid scent of burning linoleum that had been haunting the place for weeks. Our contractor insisted it was just old floor adhesive breaking down, but adhesive doesn't spontaneously combust, and it certainly doesn't smell like flesh. "Marcus, you down there?" Dr. Helena Voss's voice echoed down the stairwell. As the lead historian on our preservation team, she'd been documenting the facility's past with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. I'd started avoiding her lately, not because of her work, but because of the questions she'd begun asking. "Yeah, still here," I called back, my voice bouncing off the narrow corridor. The acoustics in this place were all wrong. Sounds lingered too long, doubled back on themselves, whispered in corners where no one stood. Her footsteps approached, deliberate and measured. Helena appeared in the doorway of cell 47, carrying her leather satchel and wearing that expression she got when she discovered something that excited her. It was the same look she'd had last week when she'd found the execution records. "I brought the dowsing rods," she said, pulling 2 L-shaped copper rods from her bag. "Local historians swear by them for finding unmarked graves and other things." I stared at the rods, their dull surface catching the harsh fluorescent lights we'd rigged throughout the building. Something cold crawled up my spine. Not the familiar chill of the prison, but something else entirely. Something that made my throat feel tight. "Helena, we've been through this. We're historians, not ghost hunters." She stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her perfume mixing with that persistent burnt smell. "Just humor me. The records I found yesterday." She paused, studying my face. "There was a man executed here in 1985. Harold Pembroke. Hanged for murder, but the paperwork's incomplete. No record of where they buried him. The tightness in my throat increased. I touched my neck unconsciously, feeling phantom pressure against my windpipe. So? So the old-timers in town say he's still here, that his spirit never left. Helena extended one of the rods toward me. They say if you ask the right question while holding these, they'll point you toward whatever, or whoever, you're looking for. I took the rod, and immediately my chest began to burn. Not pain exactly, but a sensation like ice water flooding my lungs. The copper felt warm against my palm, almost alive, and I had the ridiculous urge to drop it and run. "What question?" I heard myself ask. Helena smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. Her eyes held a gleam that hadn't been there before, and when she spoke, her voice carried an odd resonance. "Ask who Harold wants to hear from." The words hit me like a physical blow. My vision swam, and for a moment the corridor seemed to stretch impossibly long. The smell of burning linoleum intensified until I could taste it, metallic and sharp. My free hand went to my throat again, and I could swear I felt rope fibers against my skin. "I don't think—" "Just ask," Helena insisted, her voice now carrying that strange echo. "Ask who Harold wants to hear from." Before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out. "Who does Harold want to hear from?" The dowsing rod in my hand swung with violent force, the tip pointing directly at my chest, not toward my general direction, specifically at my heart, as if drawn by some invisible magnet. The sensation of rope around my neck tightened, and the taste of burnt plastic filled my mouth. Helena's rod did the same thing, both pieces of copper now aimed at me like accusations. "Interesting," she murmured, and her voice sounded different somehow. Older, more masculine. "Very interesting." I staggered backward, the rod still pulling toward my chest with impossible force. The corridor began to darken at the edges, and I could hear something. Footsteps overhead, slow and measured, like someone pacing back and forth, but we were the only ones in the building. "Helena, what the hell?" She looked up at me, and for just a moment, her face wasn't her face at all. The features were similar, but the expression was wrong, twisted by something hungry and desperate. When she spoke, it was with a man's voice, deep and gravelly, tinged with a southern accent that hadn't been there before. "Been waiting so long," the voice said through Helena's mouth. "So long for someone who'd listen, someone who'd understand." I dropped the rod and ran. The copper clattered against the concrete, but I could still feel its pull, as if invisible threads connected it to my chest. Behind me, Helena's laughter followed, except it wasn't her laughter. It was deeper, harsher, filled with decades of rage and longing. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my boots echoing in the narrow stairwell. The rope sensation around my neck tightened with each step, and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. By the time I reached the main floor, I was gasping for air that wouldn't come. The prison's main corridor stretched before me, longer than it should have been. The exit sign glowed red at the far end, but it seemed miles away. Every cell door I passed stood open, revealing nothing but darkness within. And from each doorway came the sound of breathing, slow, labored breaths, like someone choking. I forced myself to keep moving, though my legs felt like lead. The burning linoleum smell was overwhelming now, mixed with something else. The musty scent of old rope, the kind that's been hanging in a damp place for years. With each step, the invisible noose around my throat tightened, and I began to understand with growing horror that I wasn't just imagining it. Halfway to the exit, I heard Helena's voice again, but now it was coming from everywhere at once. The speakers of our radio system, the air vents, the walls themselves. "Marcus," she called, but underneath her voice was that other one, that masculine whisper that spoke of decades spent in a cold, dark place. "Where are you going? Harold just wants to talk." I reached the exit doors and threw myself against the crash bar. Nothing happened. I pushed again, harder, panic rising in my chest. The doors were locked from the outside, impossible since I'd been the last one to enter that morning. The footsteps overhead had stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and irregular. And underneath it, another sound, the creak of rope under weight, rhythmic and patient. "He's been watching you, Marcus," Helena's voice continued, now coming from directly behind me. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. "All these months you've been here, fixing his home, learning about his life. He's grown quite fond of you." I pulled out my cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. The battery was full, but the device was completely dead. In the black reflection of the screen, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. The shadow of a figure hanging behind me, swaying gently from side to side. When I turned, there was nothing there. "You can't leave, Marcus," the voice said. And now I couldn't tell if it was Helena speaking or someone else entirely. "Not yet. Harold has been so lonely. 37 years he's been waiting for someone who could hear him properly. Someone sensitive to the in-between places." I tried the doors again, throwing my full weight against them. The metal groaned but held firm. Outside, I could see my truck parked in the lot, the October sun still shining on a world that suddenly felt very far away. The rope sensation tightened again, and this time I felt my feet leave the ground for just a moment. When I touched down, my shoes made no sound against the floor. "You used the rods," the voice continued, closer now. "You asked the question. That makes you part of it now, part of the connection. Harold's been waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between here and there." I began pounding on the doors, screaming for help that I knew wouldn't come. The sound echoed through the empty facility, bouncing off walls that had heard so many other screams over the decades. And with each echo, the voices multiplied. Not just Helena and the thing that spoke through her, but others. Dozens of others, all whispering my name. "Marcus," they said in unison, their voices creating a harmony that made my teeth ache. "Marcus, don't be afraid. We're all here. We're all waiting." I slumped against the doors, feeling the fight drain out of me. The rope around my neck was no longer invisible. I could see it now, thick hemp fibers stained with age and something darker. It extended upward into the shadows of the ceiling, where the acoustic tiles had peeled away to reveal the original wooden beams. From those beams, other ropes hung down, dozens of them, swaying gently in a breeze that shouldn't exist. And at the end of each rope, shadows that might have been bodies, or might have been nothing at all. "The thing about dowsing," Helena's voice said, now coming from right beside my ear, "is that it's not about finding what you're looking for. It's about what's looking for you." I could feel her breath against my neck, but when I turned, she wasn't there. No one was there. Just the empty corridor, the hanging shadows, and the growing certainty that I wasn't alone in this place, that I never had been. The rope around my neck loosened slightly, just enough for me to breathe, but I could feel it there, waiting, patient as stone, patient as death, patient as 37 years of solitude in a place where time moves differently. Outside, my truck sat in the afternoon sun. Inside, the shadows grew longer, and the voices grew quieter, and somewhere in the darkness between what was real and what couldn't possibly be real, Harold Pembroke settled in to wait a little longer. After all, he had all the time in the world, and now, it seemed, so did I. The dowsing rods lay abandoned in cell block D, their copper surfaces reflecting nothing at all. But sometimes, when the wind blew through the broken windows of the old prison, they would turn slowly toward each other, as if pulled by invisible hands, as if they were still searching, as if they had found exactly what they were looking for. Story 14. The first time I saw her walking past my window, I knew something had shifted in the fabric of this godforsaken town. Sarah Mackenzie moved like morning mist through the dusty streets of Millbrook, her auburn hair catching fragments of sunlight that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sheriff Mackenzie's daughter had returned from the city after 3 years, and with her came a heaviness I couldn't quite name, a pressure that settled behind my eyes and made the air taste metallic. I'd been living in the old Hartwell house on Elm Street for 6 months by then, renting the place from a landlord who seemed eager to have anyone willing to overlook its reputation. The previous tenant had left suddenly, the neighbors whispered, though they never explained why. The house itself felt hollow, its walls thin enough that I could hear conversations from 3 houses down on quiet nights. But it was Sarah's voice I found myself listening for, even when I knew she wasn't there. The obsession began innocently enough, or so I told myself. I'd catch glimpses of her through my kitchen window as she walked to the general store, her movements deliberate and graceful in a way that seemed almost choreographed. Sometimes she'd pause at the corner of Elm and Main, looking back toward my house with an expression I couldn't decipher. During those moments, the world around her would grow unnaturally still, as if even the wind held its breath in her presence. I started timing my errands to coincide with her daily routines. The post office at 10:30, the library on Tuesday afternoons, the diner on Fridays where she'd sit alone at the corner booth, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. I never approached her directly. The weight of her father's badge and the town's watchful eyes kept me at a respectful distance, but I found myself studying her profile, memorizing the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came during a particularly humid evening in late September. I'd been sitting on my front porch, nursing a lukewarm beer and watching the shadows lengthen across the street, when I noticed 2 thin branches that had fallen from the oak tree in my front yard. They lay crossed in the dirt near the sidewalk, forming a perfect X. Something about their positioning bothered me. Too precise, too deliberate for mere chance. That night I dreamed of Sarah standing in my living room, her lips moving without sound. She gestured toward the window, then placed her finger to her lips in a gesture of silence. When I woke, my mouth was dry and the taste of copper lingered on my tongue. The crossed branches were still there in the morning, untouched by the wind that had scattered everything else across the yard. I began paying attention to patterns after that, the way certain objects arranged themselves when I wasn't looking, the subtle shifts in the house's atmosphere that seemed to correspond with Sarah's presence in town. On days when she passed my street, the temperature in my living room would drop several degrees, and the old radiator would emit a low humming sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The bathroom mirror would fog without explanation, and sometimes I'd find it covered in a thin film of condensation that spelled out letters I couldn't quite make sense of. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week of October, when the first frost had already claimed most of the neighborhood gardens. I'd been struggling with insomnia for days, my sleep fractured by dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. In these visions, Sarah and I would have long conversations about everything and nothing. Her fear of returning to city life, my reasons for choosing such an isolated existence, the way the town seemed to trap people in amber, preserving them but never letting them truly live. During one particularly vivid episode, she'd asked me if I believed in messages from beyond the veil of ordinary perception. I'd told her I wasn't sure what I believed anymore, that living in Millbrook had made me question the boundaries between possible and impossible. She'd smiled then, an expression both sad and knowing, and told me that some questions could only be answered through faith. That's when I remembered the old divination methods my grandmother had taught me during childhood summers. The way 2 sticks or bones could be cast to divine yes or no answers, depending on how they fell. It seemed ridiculous, but everything about my current situation had already crossed the line into the absurd. If Sarah somehow existed in the spaces between what I could see and what I could understand, perhaps there was a way to reach across that gap. I found 2 straight branches in my backyard, each about 8 inches long and roughly the same thickness. They felt warm in my hands despite the October chill, and when I held them together, I could swear I felt a faint vibration running through the wood. The sensation was so subtle I almost convinced myself it was nothing more than my imagination, but the feeling persisted as I carried them inside. My living room had become a shrine to routine over the months. The same chair facing the same window, the same coffee cup on the same side table, everything arranged to maximize my view of the street where Sarah walked. The brick wall behind my couch was stained with water damage from some long-ago leak, creating patterns that sometimes looked like faces in the right light. It was against this wall that I decided to conduct my experiment. Standing in the center of the room, I held the 2 branches above my head and spoke aloud to the empty air, feeling simultaneously foolish and electrified. The words came without conscious thought, as if they'd been waiting inside me for weeks. Sarah, if you can hear me, if you exist in whatever space lies between what I see and what I feel, please show me. Do you enjoy my presence here? Do you welcome the attention I've been paying to your comings and goings? I let the branches fall. They hit the hardwood floor with a sharp double crack that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. When the sound finally faded, I looked down to see them lying in a perfect cross, one overlapping the other at precise 90-degree angles. The sight sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the temperature, but I needed more than geometric coincidence. My rational mind, the part that still functioned despite weeks of strange dreams and impossible sensations, demanded concrete proof that this wasn't simply my subconscious manipulating random events to fit a desired narrative. If this is real, I said to the room, my voice barely above a whisper, if you're really here and not just a product of my isolation and imagination, then give me something I can't explain away. Show me something that will make me believe. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic sounds from the street, no settling of the old house's bones, no whisper of wind through the gaps around the windows. The world had drawn a breath and forgotten to exhale. Then the lamp beside my reading chair began to flicker. It was an old brass lamp I'd inherited with the furnished rental, its shade yellowed with age and its cord frayed in several places. I'd been meaning to replace it for months, but had never gotten around to it. Now it stuttered between light and darkness with increasing frequency, creating a stroboscopic effect that made the room's shadows dance across the walls. I approached it slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flickering intensified as I drew closer, and I could smell something burning. Not the sharp ozone scent of electrical malfunction, but something organic and smoky, like wood or paper catching fire. The bulb went out with a sound like breaking glass, though when I examined it later, the filament was intact. In the sudden darkness, the scent of burning intensified, and I became aware of a soft hissing sound, like air escaping from a punctured tire. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to acknowledge what I was witnessing. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and in the dim light filtering through my curtains from the street lamps outside, I could see tendrils of something dark and ethereal rising from where the lamp had been. But it wasn't smoke from the lamp itself. The wisps of darkness were emerging from the brick wall behind my couch, seeping through the mortar like fog through a cemetery gate. As they accumulated, they began to take shape, not the random billowing of actual smoke, but deliberate patterns that suggested intention and intelligence. The dark tracery spread across the brick surface with purpose, creating lines and curves that my mind struggled to interpret. At first it looked like abstract art, the kind of accidental beauty that emerges from chaos. But as more of the sooty substance accumulated, a recognizable form began to emerge, a heart. Perfect in its symmetry, complete in its detail, drawn in what appeared to be soot or ash against the red brick wall. The edges were crisp and deliberate, the proportions exactly what a love-struck teenager might carve into a tree trunk. It was impossible and undeniable, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I stared at the image for what felt like hours, my mind cycling through increasingly desperate attempts at rational explanation. Gas leak causing hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning creating false perceptions, a neighbor playing an elaborate prank using hidden projectors or chemical reactions. Each theory felt more ridiculous than the last, but the alternative, accepting that I was witnessing genuine supernatural communication, seemed equally impossible. The heart remained on the wall as dawn approached, as solid and real as anything else in the room. I touched it with trembling fingers and came away with dark residue on my skin that smelled of wood smoke, and something indefinable, something that reminded me of summer afternoons and childhood promises, and the peculiar sadness that comes with understanding that some things can never be recovered. Over the following days, I found myself avoiding the living room, spending most of my time in the kitchen and bedroom where I couldn't see the mark on the wall. But I could feel its presence, a constant weight in my peripheral awareness that made concentration impossible. My sleep became even more fractured, filled with dreams where Sarah and I walked through empty houses, filled with messages written in smoke and shadow. She appeared in these visions with increasing frequency, sometimes speaking in words I couldn't quite remember upon waking, sometimes communicating through gestures and expressions that seemed more eloquent than language. In one particularly vivid dream, she stood beside the brick wall in my living room, pointing at the heart shape and nodding with satisfaction, as if confirming that her message had been received and understood. But during my waking hours, I saw her less and less on the streets of Millbrook. Her daily routines became erratic, her appearances brief and elusive. When I did catch glimpses of her, she seemed somehow diminished, as if the act of reaching across whatever divide separated us had drained something essential from her presence in the ordinary world. The rational part of my mind whispered that this was evidence of my deteriorating mental state, that as my fantasies became more elaborate and consuming, my perception of reality became correspondingly unstable. Perhaps there had never been any mysterious patterns or supernatural communications. Perhaps I had simply been watching a normal young woman live her normal life while my isolated imagination transformed ordinary coincidences into cosmic significance. But the heart remained on the wall, dark and definitive against the red brick. Visitors might dismiss it as a stain or an oddly shaped shadow, but I knew better. I had witnessed its creation, felt the heat, and smelled the smoke of its manifestation. Whatever else might be uncertain, that moment of impossible beauty was unquestionably real. Or was it? As the weeks passed, I found myself standing before the mark for hours at a time, studying its edges and questioning my own memory. Had it always been there? Was it possible that my mind had simply attached supernatural significance to a pre-existing water stain or patch of discoloration? The longer I stared, the more I doubted what I thought I had experienced. The town around me continued its placid existence, oblivious to my internal struggle. Sheriff Mackenzie nodded politely when we passed on the street, apparently unaware that his daughter had become the central focus of my increasingly unstable world. The other residents of Millbrook went about their business with the comfortable predictability of people who had never questioned the nature of reality or wondered if the boundaries between possible and impossible might be more fluid than generally assumed. Sometimes, in moments of clarity, I recognized the warning signs of a mind under stress. The isolation, the obsessive behavior, the willingness to accept extraordinary explanations for ordinary events. All classic symptoms of someone losing their grip on consensus reality. But then I would return to my living room and see the heart on the wall, and all my rational objections would crumble before the undeniable evidence of something beyond my understanding. The final confirmation came on a gray November morning, when I woke to find a thin layer of ash covering every surface in my living room. It was so fine it might have been dust, except for the way it sparkled faintly in the weak sunlight filtering through my windows. The heart on the wall seemed darker and more defined than ever, as if the presence responsible for its creation had grown stronger overnight. I swept up the ash and disposed of it, but by evening it had returned, settling over my furniture like a benediction or a curse. This pattern continued for several days, each morning bringing a fresh coating of the mysterious residue, each evening revealing its inexplicable renewal. On the fourth day, I noticed that the ash had begun to form patterns of its own, arranging itself into words and symbols across my coffee table and bookshelves. The messages were fragmentary and cryptic, but they all seemed to center around themes of longing and connection, of souls reaching across impossible distances to touch each other in the only ways available to them. I stopped trying to clean it away after that, accepting instead that my home had become a repository for communications from whatever realm Sarah Mackenzie inhabited. Whether that realm existed in the supernatural landscape of genuine ghostly presence or in the equally mysterious territory of my own subconscious, I could no longer say with certainty. The distinction had ceased to matter. Real or imagined, the connection I felt transcended the limitations of normal human interaction, creating an intimacy more profound than anything I had experienced in the ordinary world. In that sense, the heart on the wall represented the most authentic relationship of my adult life, a love affair conducted entirely through symbols and suggestions, never confirmed but never denied, always hovering in the space between hope and delusion, where the most powerful emotions reside. I still live in the house on Elm Street, still watch for Sarah's figure on the street below, still conduct my conversations with empty air and crossed sticks, The heart remains on the brick wall, neither fading nor growing more pronounced, a permanent reminder that some questions are more important than their answers, and that the human capacity for connection extends far beyond the boundaries of conventional possibility. Whether Sarah Mackenzie truly communicates with me from beyond the veil of ordinary perception, or whether my isolation has created an elaborate fantasy to fill the void of human contact, no longer seems like the most relevant question. What matters is the warmth I feel when standing before that sooty heart, the sense of being understood and accepted that has somehow emerged from the most improbable circumstances. In the end, perhaps the nature of love itself is always somewhat supernatural, a reaching across the impossible distances that separate one consciousness from another, a faith that connection is possible even when all evidence suggests otherwise. If my relationship with Sarah exists only in the realm of symbol and suggestion, it is no less real for being impossible, no less meaningful for being beyond rational explanation. The heart on the wall bears witness to the truth that some forms of communication transcend the physical world, that longing itself can create its own reality, and that the boundary between sanity and madness may be far less important than the boundary between isolation and connection. In that space where questions matter more than answers, where faith trumps evidence, where love requires no proof beyond its own existence, I have found a form of companionship that sustains me regardless of its ultimate nature. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the ash settles fresh across my furniture and the heart on the wall seems to pulse with its own inner light, I sometimes hear Sarah's voice whispering my name with a tenderness that makes all questions irrelevant, all doubts insignificant, all need for rational explanation fade into the beautiful ambiguity of a mystery that explains itself.